Good evening. Good evening. We are here at a Tuesday night workshop, and it's a continuation about the ordinance, the proposed shelter ordinance. And Director Hediger, I'll let you start us off.
Sure. So hopefully everybody has their ordinance from last meeting. We left off on page 7. I believe we wrapped up with the exemption section. So unless there was any questions remaining with that, we were moving along, reminding the board that the highlighted sections are areas that we were just kind of bringing to your attention because they might have been of substantive change or just worthy of noting. So moving on to page 8. Sorry.
Councilor LaChapelle.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Director. I guess I just want to review really quickly on the exemption part of it. And I think our esteemed counsel from Ward 2 that caught a lot of this. I'm concerned on the fact that we're going to bring or forced to bring all the other shelters to a certain standard. Open 24 hours a day, and some of the other standards. And I'd like to understand the reasoning behind that, and what is the burden to those shelters that have been here for a long time. I'm just concerned on adding these extra layers to that shelter, to the existing shelters. And what are the other standards that they're going to have to improve to do?
Sure. So just get my bearings here again. So the standards that would need to be met all start on page 5. So approval and operation requirements. So under letter I, there are 16 criteria in total that new licensed establishments would need to meet. The intent of section J is to exempt existing shelters from a certain number of those 16 criteria. Certainly Craig and Amy can weigh into this as well, but I believe the intent there was, quite frankly, to give the benefit of the doubt to some of these existing establishments, given where they are located in the community, with respect to maybe public transportation and their proximity to schools and churches, other homeless shelters, accessibility, not to place too much of a burden on them, but at the same time recognizing that they are going to need to come into compliance within a 5-year period, or what we've proposed here, by not later than January 1st of 28. So that way that they will have to meet some of these standards in time, but not all of them. And I guess I'd maybe ask Craig maybe to expand upon the committee's rationale.
If I may, Mr. Mayor.
Go ahead, Councilor.
Before I get to Craig, and I'd love to hear, or Amy for that matter, just like item 14, no more than 2 unrelated individuals allowed per bedroom. That's an absolutely ludicrous standard as far as I'm concerned. Now HUD, if you're taking HUD money, I understand that there's a requirement they have to have individual bedrooms. I look at when I sent my 2 sons to college and paid a lot of money to send them to college, there were 4 guys in the same bedroom, and they had a shared bathroom with 3 other rooms. So there were 12 people with a shared bathroom. If it's good enough for my kid, for me to pay $60,000 a year now, what the tuition is, it's damn sure good enough to have somebody that's in a homeless shelter. So just to require somebody not to have no more than 2 unrelated people in a room just blows my mind and is not logical at all, unless it's related to HUD money. These people are not receiving HUD money, the existing shelters that are there now. If they want to have individual bedrooms, that's fine, more power to them, but I do not believe it should be a requirement. And I have a problem with that exactly 14, and some of the other issues. And I don't even believe that we should have 14 in it for any new shelter that opens up. That should not be a requirement for anybody if they want to open a shelter. And I can go down a list of them. And I know that our city administrator's chomping at the bits to.
Well, Counselor, I just want to make sure you understand, unless I misread it, Section 14 with the beds is permanently exempt for the existing shelters. So that would not be a criteria that they would ever have to meet.
It's an exemption.
So items 8, 9, 10, 13, and 14, the existing shelters will not have to meet those. Everything else there has that 5-year window.
Okay, then then I'll look at, when I go to somebody else's turn, I'll look at those. But I'd like to actually remove it from anybody
Okay.
and give the new shelter the option, the ability to have more space if need be, and not tie their hands. If they can have 4, 5, 6 people dormitory style, why not give them that ability? So I personally would like to remove it and just from everybody and give anybody that opportunity, not just the existing one. So I'll sit back and just scan real quickly. I missed that. And I will follow it up. I'll come back in a moment. But what's your thoughts in regards to removing that for
Well,
everybody?
if I can, 1 second. Sorry, Counselor, is that, Counselor Herman, did you have something to chime in, or was your point made by the administrator?
The administrator made my point.
Excellent, okay. Please proceed.
Yeah, so as Heather pointed out, it is in the exemptions, and we were thinking about a number of those things in terms of, how do existing shelters operate today, and how have they designed, basically, like, where are their buildings located, how have they designed their buildings, and how are they kind of locked into a certain way of service provision based upon those design standards. So that was the logic behind a number of the exemptions that were there, so that they wouldn't be burdened in that way. I also lived I lived with 3 other roommates in a unit that was meant for 2 people my freshman year in college, and we got along okay. But I think the difference here is many people who are homeless are dealing with a lot of other life stressors, mental health challenges. The research is that the more privacy one has, the better their chances at recovery. And some of the things that we were thinking about, there are best practices and standards that HUD is starting to push shelters towards, and this is an example of one of those things. But I guess the committee was also being mindful of what are reasons that people might leave a shelter when they're not ready to, and conflict with a stranger that they don't know might be one of those reasons. And so when they leave, when they're not ready to leave the shelter, then that could potentially be putting them in conflict with the public. So the committee had debated, had considered no unrelated individuals. This question of the economics of running a shelter came up. Some of the folks involved in operating shelters said 2 unrelated individuals could work. This, of course, doesn't prohibit having more people share a room that are related in some way. So if they're a family or if they're partnered, showing up to the shelter together as a socially related people, then they could occupy a bigger room. 6, could be 6 people in a room, or I don't know exactly what the limit would be, but so that would be permissible. So that was the logic behind it.
1 second. Yeah, please
Yeah,
continue.
just one other thing to add. When we talked about this a lot, Rick, and I think one of the things I really learned through this process is it's not about a bed for the night. It's about helping people transition out of homelessness and being able to have a little more privacy, have a little more stability. Has been, over the last 10 years or so, all the research has shown that that's just a much better chance for long-term success. So what we're recommending in this ordinance is let's follow the best practices for helping people actually transition out, so it's not just a bed for the night.
Anything further, Mr. Sotomayor?
No?
Councilor LaChapelle?
I Agree. I have no problem with it. I just thought it's putting more restrictions on you. And if you have that flexibility, if you want to run it that way, that's great. All of a sudden, another shelter wants to open up and they're going to have 6 per bedroom. I guess I'd rather have 6 per bedroom than 6 sleeping in the gazebo. So it just opens up. That's all I'm saying. I'm trying to give more flexibility, more control over the facility to the facility operators. And this really ties hands. Again, if you're getting subsidies from HUD, you have to follow certain requirements. I don't know if the municipality, if there's a need for something like this from the municipality. And I was just reading, again, looking 8 through 14, what is the Maine State Housing Authority monitoring? Is this a computer program? This is still talking about some of the regulations. Is this a computer program? How incumbent is this?
So monitoring would only apply if a group is receiving funding from Maine Housing.
Okay.
So it's not requiring Maine Housing monitoring of groups that are not receiving the funding. And I think what it's saying is the city would like to see the monitoring report if that monitoring is being done. So it's a condition of funding. It's Maine Housing basically following up to say, we gave you this money to meet certain objectives. Did you meet them? How's your facility doing? So it's not the monitoring is not quite a license, but the amount of oversight involved is pretty stringent, really more stringent than a lot of what we're talking about here. So it sort of almost goes beyond what licensing looks like in terms of what they check for and what they require.
And if I recall the last meeting, we were adding number 2 to that list of exemptions, hours of operation.
Yes, correct.
Okay, so that I don't make the same mistake twice, we're looking at 2, 8, 9, 10, 13, and 14.
Correct.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
How does, I guess, do you, either of you would like to respond to hours of operation and why the committee suggested that all shelters operate 24 hours a day?
That gets, it's a similar thought process. I mean, in general, we think that residents are better served, and again, we can avoid these instances of, or we can mitigate, I don't want to say avoid because nothing's guaranteed, but we can mitigate the extent to which people who are seeking services at a homeless shelter are being made to leave when they're not ready to. That is certainly the way we'd like to see new shelters set up. Ideally, all of them would be able to meet that standard. A number of the existing shelters do, but there are 2 that do not. And I think that, I did talk to all the shelters, and I think the point is legitimate that it might, the additional staffing required could be a burden for them. So if the council chooses to exempt them from that, then I understand why they would want to do that.
Councilor McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Now, you're saying that these exemptions are some of these exemptions are going to expire in 5 years? So then the existing shelters would have to?
They ramp up in 5 years.
I mean, like ADA compatible, accessibility?
That one wouldn't expire.
That
That
one-
exemption would be permanent.
That exemption would be permanent.
So
And
the
what about
design one-
hours of operation?
That's permanent as well.
That's a permanent exemption.
Well, as it's been discussed, I think that's a new one on the table. And
Yeah.
I believe what's being suggested is that would be a permanent exemption. It doesn't say that on the page, but I believe that's what's been requested.
Okay, that's what I'm
That's-
trying to, because the last thing we want to do is we don't want to put current shelters out of business.
Correct.
New regulations, because a lot of these shelters have been around for a long period of time, have served to the best of their abilities. The homelessness the homeless population, and the last thing I want to do, now, the current shelters we have now, I've never been in one, and I apologize for that, I should have paid visits to them. Do they have more congregate housing than the 2 per bedroom net currently?
On average, I think it's safe to say that they might in some cases, yeah.
So that's probably one we'd want to consider exempting also.
But that one's already exempt.
That one is exempt
Yeah,
too?
that's already on there in the exemption list.
Okay,
I think we agree with your concern is that we're not looking necessarily to penalize existing shelters.
correct,
Yeah, the idea is that the building's already been built.
correct.
At the same time, by 2028, there can be some expectations as far as like providing statistics as far as the clientele that they're serving and whatnot. So the thought is we get a better handle as to who is actually staying at these establishments, how long are they there, where they're coming from.
I'm all for more information, the better. I just don't want to put anybody in any of these shelters in jeopardy and lower the number of beds we have available rather than increasing the number. Thank you.
Mr. Sotomayor, you mentioned that there were 2 shelters that that are not 24/7? And when you spoke to them, they were hesitant or wholly resistant to ramping up to all day, every day?
They expressed that it could be very challenging to get to that level. I mean, yeah, in general, the existing shelters believe that they would prefer not to have additional licensing requirements or regulations at all. That was the general feedback I got. And they also, they're concerned about regulations, further regulations, but they also kind of took the position of, well, the city will decide what they'd like to do, and we'll do our best to, adapt to that or respond in some way. So they were hesitant to get too specific about what specifically they'd like to see out of an ordinance.
Thank you. Councilor Jelinas?
Thank you. So I, for one, am not in support of exempting the hours of operation for existing shelters. And my reason for that is, and let me preface my comments by saying that I'm very appreciative of the work that's been done by existing establishments for years and years and years. But I also believe very strongly that just because we've done things a certain way, it doesn't mean that that's the way to continue doing it. And as I speak to constituents and talk to business owners, all around, one of the things that I hear all the time is the people that are homeless on the streets. Where do you expect them to go? If we're ever really going to address homelessness, if we're ever really going to address, some kind of solution to this, we have to look at the way we're addressing it, right? And I just have concern that the way that we've been doing it, while I'm appreciative, I'm not sure it's best practice, and it's not solving anything. And I've used this analogy with some of my colleagues before. I'll say it again. It's great to feed someone, it's great to give them a fish, but if you can teach them how to fish and really give them the resources that they need. And I also feel that it's not like we're, in any industry, there's changes and we have to go with the times and look at best practice and do what we can. And it's not like we're saying you've got to come into compliance in 24 months. I fully believe that the existing organizations would have the support to make it happen. We live in Maine, and during the days in the winter, it's really cold. It's really cold. And I think about just the humanity in that. It doesn't make any sense for me as an official. I have a really hard time with that. So I just need to go on record and say that I am not one that supports limiting hours of operation. I will do everything that I can to help the existing organizations come into compliance. But I think that with anything, when we think about human services, just because we've always done things a certain way, it doesn't make it the best way. And I would just encourage us to be opening our minds a little bit to best practice. And I appreciate the research that you've shared. I, too, don't believe that it's just providing a bed for those 12 hours and then letting them go on the streets. I just felt strongly about that, and I wanted to share my opinion. Thank you.
Councillor Clement?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I too,
Councillor Clement?
try not to shout into it. I too would find a problem with limiting hours of operation. Perhaps Director Hediger could address a common practice with zoning and codes would be to grandfather those entities, businesses, or existences already in effect when it comes to new regulations. That's fairly common practice.
Yes, it is.
And for that very reason, I think that if we do anything that's going to reduce the number of current beds or create problems, I mean, I'm all for things like life safety and everything, but 24-hour operation, some of these shelters were not designed around that. They don't have, to my knowledge, the wherewithal to operate 24 hours. And I just can't see forcing them into compliance in that regard. New shelters, they're coming into it, they're going to have to meet whatever regulations are there. I don't have any problem with that, but to come down hard on existing groups that have served the community well, I just don't think that's fair, and I would not vote in favor of it. Thank you.
Councillor Harriman?
Thank you. I would concur with Councilor Jelinas. I feel like more than 5 years is adequate for existing shelters to come into compliance with a new programmatic sort of restriction. I agree with the other things that are already exempted. Like if you're not close to a bus line, you can't just pick up your building and move it closer. So that makes total sense. But yeah, just going by the best practices, I feel like more than 5 years is more than enough time to come into compliance. Thank you.
My concern is what happens right now. Yeah, I mean, there's Councillor Jones mentioned this. You know, when it's 10 below out during the day, are they outside or are there exemptions? Like, I'm not sure exactly how that would work. And then, yeah, they end up on the streets, and some of them certainly beeline it straight to the library. And I think it just kind of places an undue burden on the rest of the city, the city of Lewiston, and then neighboring businesses. And yeah, so I'm concerned about that continuing to happen especially when we're mandating that new shelters be 24/7. Councilor McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, my concern is the cost to these shelters. You're looking at doubling their hours of operation. You're looking at increased use of electricity, increased use of heating, because they'll have to keep it up to temperature for 24 hours a day. We're not talking about a small amount of money. And I really think that is too much of a burden to place on these shelters. It's, you know, it's one thing if it was just a matter of leaving the door open and letting people mingle, but the reality is if you're open during the day, you're probably going to need more manpower during the day than you do at night when people are sleeping. So you're looking at more than a 100% increase in manpower because of that fact that it's going to be daytime hours, not nighttime hours, plus the other factors that go into that. I would dare say that you would see some of these shelters close, and it would be the opposite of what we're looking. I mean, we're not, these shelters do not have deep pockets funding them. And I really would be extremely careful about the extra burden we put on them, seeing is that they're, you know, what they're doing now. I would really be concerned about that. I think that you would put some out of business and we would be behind instead of ahead. Thank you.
Councillor Scott.
Thank you. So I'm hearing both sides here, and I don't disagree that I would not want to put the burden on a shelter in having to comply in the fear that they might close down. I do have concerns about that, but I'm also looking at a 5-year time period here. So I'm wondering if this particular issue, so that we can keep moving forward, is there any way that that one particular piece, we want to keep at 24/7 for any new shelter coming in? Because I think that's extremely important when it comes to the weather, anything new that we're existing. But for our existing shelters, if maybe that particular piece, we can have more conversation around, are they going to be able to comply, a further extensive conversation with them? Is this something that's going to be feasible for you in 5 years? What would the burden be? And maybe that's something that we can help with in respect to something to that effect, right? So maybe that they would be available to get some other funding, maybe a federal funding, and be willing to comply with some of the other stuff that's in there. I'm just putting that out there as maybe a compromise for right now so that we can move past this particular piece, because I'm hearing both sides, and I think they're all valid in what you're saying. It's just that how do we keep going with this? 5 years, does that give us time to have that conversation with some of the existing shelters to see if, Hope Haven may say, no, that's never going to happen for us, but Trinity may say, okay, well, we're going to maybe work things out a little differently and be willing to do that. And I'm just throwing those names out there. That's not reference to any of them being the ones that are going to do that, but just as an example, is there a way that we can do that so that this one piece, we don't have to say right now, we're going to make this happen? We either neither exempt it as in grant, or, you know what I mean? We don't grandfather that particular piece right now, and we don't say that it has to happen right now. Is that a possibility?
I guess, and that was going back to my point earlier, like, is it possible or impossible when you were speaking to the shelters?
Well, first of all, I'll just reiterate that this was, I think, probably the most divisive subject for the shelter committee. Not the 24/7 specifically, but the exemption, whether to have exemptions, the 5-year grace period, or just permanent exemption for the existing shelters. So there was a lot of debate. I would look to David on the question of how it would be worded or addressed in the ordinance to get to your question, Linda. I think that, well, I hesitate to speak for the shelters on a specific question, but when I brought up some of these things, the concerns that are being raised were expressed, concerns about having to not having the funding to meet the requirement and potentially having to shut down. I know that, I should leave it at that because I don't want to put more words in their mouth, but that was definitely expressed to me when we were discussing this.
I think I'd add, I noted at the last meeting, with respect to this section here, we absolutely need to advise those shelters that exist in the community of when this public hearing is scheduled, because we need to make them aware that regardless of what we're discussing tonight, there are expectations of them in 5 years from now that we really need to make them aware of, and so they can participate in this process. Could we reach out to the existing establishments and ask them how burdensome any one of these criteria could be? I suppose staff could do that. I suppose the committee could do that. I'm sure they're going to say it's a burden, depending on what these are. So it's really going to be up to the council as to whether or not there's a different expectation for these establishments going forward. Could we reach out? We're going to reach out anyway. I know I will reach out in the sense that, hey, shelters, there's going to be a hearing sometime in September. This is the date. You should review this. Particularly, you might want to pay attention to some of these sections here. But beyond that, as far as how difficult is that going to be for them for an establishment, whether it's 6 months or 6 years or 5 years we're talking about, that's a question for them, I guess.
Councilor McCarthy.
So for tonight's workshop, we can just leave it as is, and we can change that when it comes before the council again?
So yes, we have a number of changes that we're going to make that the council kind of gave us a thumbs up on, and we can draft it that way. And you folks are going to get some input, I would imagine, from the public that evening. You certainly, I don't know that that's a substantive change. Certainly, city administration can weigh in on that as well, but if there's certain changes like that that aren't necessarily substantive, you guys could make those on the floor that evening.
Okay, thank you.
Councilor LaChapelle.
So as of the last meeting, when the full council was here, number 2 was on the list of exemptions. There was the thumbs up last meeting. Am I correct, administrator or director, or whomever? I'm bouncing this back and forth.
My note was to add it as an exemption and to bring it up at the hearing.
Okay. Okay, so that's added. Okay, I'll set to move forward.
So, yeah, I mean, you bring up a valid point. The shelters could come and speak during the public hearing. And if there are changes, then Administrator Hunter, depending on the changes, I guess how would that affect the ordinance at that point, and public notice and everything else?
I think it's going to depend on the sheer number of amendments to it. This has been a very public process over our many discussions, over many meetings. So it's not like it's one discussion and then we've gone straight through to changes. So I think this topic is a little, has been followed a little closer. So I think that gives us a little bit more latitude. But depending on what other amendments are on that night, it may change enough that we need to repost it. So we'll just have to see what the amendments are.
Am I to understand that substantive could be a little nebulous?
Correct.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm okay with that.
Are we done with the exemption section? Okay. So we're on page 8. You'll note that page 8, a quarter of the way down, zoning and land use code. So everything we've talked about on the previous pages is in the code of ordinances. It's the licensing section. So this section now is zoning and land use code. Any amendments made to this section do require a recommendation from the planning board. First section to bring to your attention is basically just a definition of homeless shelter. So we're coming up with a new definition in the zoning and land use code. And again, the highlighted section there is similar to what we referenced in the business licensing section, where there'll be an exemption for temporary accommodations if there's some type of local emergency. Article 11, district regulations. So right now we allow shelters as a conditional use in 2 zoning districts, neighborhood conservation B, downtown residential. Those are basically your downtown residential zoning districts, the Tree Streets, Spring, Summer Street neighborhood, that area, kind of this side of Bates College. Any of that is going to be probably downtown residential or neighborhood conservation B. That's where we currently allow shelters. As you see here, the shelter committee has recommended that we include 4 other districts: the Urban Enterprise, Mill, Riverfront, and Centerville. I believe you folks have a map. I'm not sure if it's in color with yours, but it does show you those districts and where they are located in the community. Obviously, the riverfront is the riverfront area along basically like the Smart Payne Park, Lincoln Street area. Mill is where the mill districts are, existing mill buildings are. The Centerville is kind of Lisbon Street and Main Street where the commercial activity is. And then UE is kind of a funky one. UE is spread out through a number of areas. UE goes down to Strawberry Avenue in the area of like where the Humane Society is. There's a section of UE along the railroad tracks in the Spring Street, Summer Street neighborhood. And then there's a big section of UE that goes along the river basically from Gully Brook on Lincoln Street, and UE extends all the way out to exit 80. Craig could elaborate on the expansion of those areas.
Sure. So I think we spoke about this a bit last time, but the recommendation stems from the idea that with the exception of maybe certain portions of the urban enterprise, a number of these zones are other areas that like neighborhood conservation B and town residential where shelters are currently permitted. They are also experiencing the presence of the homeless community unsheltered in those zones and could also stand to benefit from this service. We were thinking about the issue of trying to make sure that shelters are not overly concentrated, as that was, a concern that has been brought up. And I guess the other things I would point out is that some things would still, limit where they could end up in any of these zones if approved. So like item 8, for example, for new shelters is public transportation shelter must be located on or within a quarter mile of public transit. So they couldn't just be anywhere in these zones. They'd still have to abide by that requirement. And I guess the other piece I'd mention is because of the limit that will be placed on the number of shelter beds total, there wouldn't be that includes some shelters that exist right now that might add a couple shelter beds to their facility. We're not talking about many more shelters here. So it just gives some more options for what might be the most suitable location that meets the community's needs and concerns the best. They still have to go through the whole process to actually locate wherever they're going to. So we offered this as a proposal for those reasons.
Councillor Scott?
Thank you. This whole section needs to go before the planning board. Planning board is going to give their recommendation to city council. I would be very comfortable with putting that language in there and seeing what the planning board says. I would agree that we have to look at some of the zoning and expand some of the zoning. Do we necessarily have to do all of those? I'm not sure, but I would like to hear from the planning board as to what they think and having that discussion and bring it back to us. And where we've got this new list that talks about our timeline on some of this stuff with a 9/12 planning board hearing. Again, I'd like to have that conversation with them and hear what their proposal would be. That's where I would be comfortable with.
Councillor Harriman?
Thank you. Yeah, I would support the shelter committee's recommendation of adding these zoning districts, especially with if there are going to be buffers around certain uses, that really limits the places where you could put a shelter in the current 2 zones. I would just remind everyone that it would still be a conditional use, so any proposed shelter would still have to go before the planning board, even if it were in those new zones. I just think that in order, as Craig mentioned, to make sure that they're not concentrated in one neighborhood and unduly affecting one neighborhood, and to make sure that they're not just zoned out of everywhere that they could possibly be, I think it makes sense to add those districts.
If I may add one thing I failed to mention, these are also zones that have, in general, fewer, if any, single-family residences. So that was another consideration, trying to keep them further away from those zones.
Yeah, so do we feel like, Councillor McCarthy?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The only one that I have a little difficulty with is the urban enterprise. We've been told that the shelters need to be in Lewiston because that's where all of the services are, and so they should be close to these services. But most of this urban enterprise isn't near the hospitals and some of the other services that they need to provide, and I think that would not be where I would want them. As far as the other zones, I have no issue with, but I think urban enterprise doesn't belong there. Thank you.
Councillor Scott?
Just for clarification on that particular point, urban enterprise, does that not exist where behind the Peck Building going towards the River Valley, the Sunnyside Park neighborhood, where there's all of those existing empty brick buildings that I think might make a good spot for a homeless shelter. I just want to make sure we're looking at some of that too, because I think that we don't want to exclude all of that. That's why I'd like to hear the planning, my personal opinion, the planning board's comment on that.
That is why I agree with both of you that there's a big section of urban enterprise where it doesn't look like it would make a lot of sense, and the reason it came up is because there's neighborhood conservation B where it is permitted, and then there's this weird sliver of urban enterprise that Councilor Scott was just describing that looks like it would, like, not allowing it in NCB and then not right there seemed to not necessarily make the most sense, so that's why it was considered.
Director Hediger? So if this goes to the planning board will evaluate it, provide recommendations, and then this will come back to the council, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
An option that I'll throw out there, and I have mixed feelings about it, but we could consider doing an overlay as well. So if there's concerns that certain sections of the UE make more sense than others, we could simply disregard the zoning lines altogether and come up with an overlay district that says it's these areas of the community that you can have a shelter in. We have a number of overlays like that now, whether it's for floodplain, shoreland zoning, design standard districts, lodging houses, so that's another option that exists out there.
Well, to Mr. Settlemeyer's point, perhaps much of that district would be ineligible due to not being next to public transportation, and so likely a high part of it, a high amount of it is already excluded.
Possibly, I haven't, yeah.
Right, yeah.
I expect that to be the case, but I'm not 100% in terms of what proportion is or is not meeting that public transit standard.
Gotcha. Councilor Scott?
I'd like to ask Director Hediger to have the planning board have that conversation about overlay and the possibility of that, please.
So at this point, we're sending this recommendation along with a discussion about the overlay to the planning board. It appears that way.
So with that, I don't really have anything else to add. You have that, we reviewed the ordinance, right? We've reviewed the section for the business licensing that contains the performance standards and the application requirements. We've reviewed what the zoning and land use section would have. The thought at this time would be then to draft those changes and start scheduling public hearings. With that in mind, I did hand out a memo to you folks, just so everyone is aware of the deadlines and what may need to happen.
Sorry, one second,
Sure.
Director. Sorry, Councilor, did you have something?
Yes, I have a list also,
Oh.
before we get into
Nope. Sorry.
that list, I'm sure. On Article 12, homeless shelter, on the parking, I am a huge advocate of eliminating some of these parking requirements. And I let the free market be the free market. If the homeless shelter decides to put it someplace and there's a parking garage a street over, I don't think we should, again, I'm trying to take some of the burden off from the homeless shelter or the shelter in period. If I decided to open a corner store, there's a lot of times there's not a lot of parking requirements for a five and dime or just a corner variety. I personally would like to see that removed on the parking requirements for that. And I'm just not a huge parking requirement person. Now, if we were building a strip mall or something like that downtown, yes, we have to have it. They're not going to have 30 vehicles that show up at the homeless shelter to assist. If you're lucky, you're going to have 5 or 6. I would imagine for a facility that's going to have 20 people, I think 24 was the last request or something like that, you're not going to have a ton of people. So I personally would remove that. Now,
Or, sorry, is that it about parking?
On parking, yes, I have some other issues.
Well, I guess we'll take things one at a time here. Can we hear your feedback about parking?
The shelter committee didn't discuss parking. I personally am in agreement that requiring parking spaces is not consistent with smart growth principles, so. Yeah, I can't speak on behalf of the committee, but I don't
Do we
think
agree with each other?
we agree with each other, Councilor.
Excellent, this is a good day.
Want me to screw that up? I can if you want. No, actually, the three of us agree. In fact, I think we're gonna, we've talked about some zoning and land use updates with you folks, and it's my intent and Shelley's intent to come back to you folks with some additional relaxation of the parking standards for the greater downtown area. To Councilor LaChapelle's point, there's a different expectation when maybe you're on outer Sabata Street or Lisbon Street, when it's more vehicular driven to get there versus when you're in an urban environment. So I have no hard feelings about eliminating that standard either.
Any thoughts from the council about parking? Councilor Harriman?
Yeah, I'd be fine with just striking Article 12 altogether.
Two of us.
Councilor Scott, did you have anything else to add?
I would be in agreement with that as well.
Okay,
Let's make it unanimous.
okay. We've all chimed in at this point.
Did anyone bring champagne?
Well, you're not going to like me next, so I'm just...
I'll put it away. Put it away.
I think we're done here, right? We're good,
Councilors, presenters, thank you. Councilor LaChapelle, did you have anything further to add?
Yes, sir, I have like three more.
Yeah, we'll take them one at a time, please.
Thank you. I was very concerned at the last meeting when when the gentleman, I forget his name, stood up and spoke about our unhoused youth in our community, the 250 or so. And I've done a lot of soul searching, praying, and thinking about it. And I would propose, and I don't know if we can do this, I'd like to put a bed limit of 110 on a regular shelter, for 110 beds in the community for a shelter, and propose that we have an unlimited amount of beds for any school-age students that are here in our community. Send them all to here. I don't care, from any part of the state. If you're in school and you're school age and you're middle school, I'll take them all. And I'll personally fund a lot of that stuff if need be, and I'll help raise money. I don't know if that's available. There's a seventh grader is far different than a 35-year-old or a 40-year-old. I'm just concerned with that thought, and I would put some kind of stipulation, school age, or not school age, that are in school.
No.
The students that are in school, we will provide housing for them. Or we would allow a shelter, an unlimited amount of shelters for students, And if I'm wording it correctly, I think you understand the gist of it. So I'm just going to throw that out for a second. So I would put a 110 bed limit for regular shelters, beds in the city of Lewiston, and an unlimited amount of beds for students.
Mr. Stottlemyre, Director Hediger, Ms. Smith, what did we arrive at for a bed limit during our last workshop?
So 134.
Yeah.
Yeah.
134.
And my suggestion, so I mean, in that spirit, I would say, because there are 12, right now of the existing, there are 12 beds that serve youth, 12 overnight beds. So I would say subtract 12 from 134 and make that the limit. Mm-hmm. And then do as you propose.
I'm going to simply go to 120. It's a nice even number. I'm fine with 120.
That's basically it.
Just so we're all clear, you're saying bring the limit down from 134 to 120, and then an unlimited number of youth shelter beds.
Not youth, school, people, children that are in school. Children in school.
Children that are in school.
Correct.
Okay.
So we hear about, the store next door, and Larry's very passionate about that, Councilor Pease, and we have these high schools, and my understanding, we have even at grade school, unlimited. If somebody wants to build it, put the shelter up, full support, unlimited, as long as they're in school. There are requirements that have to be met. They have to be going to school. This is not a vacation land. They have to be going to school.
All right, so here's how we're going to, I guess, address this. Before I take comments from the council, I will take, feedback from our presenters, and then we will go from there. I guess your thoughts on that.
I'm not an expert in youth shelters. I can't speak to the programmatic requirement about the school piece. I guess I would point out that one of the things that we don't have, one of the things we don't have is a shelter that serves unaccompanied minors under the age of 10. So I think it would be a shame if we ended up limiting that group. Some of them might not be, in school, but in need of a shelter. So, there might be a way to meet the spirit of what you're talking about and maybe learn a little bit more about the nuances, and craft something that addresses those nuances, and the nuances I'm not prepared to speak to. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Just one comment too. Some of those kids have parents who are homeless too. So would it include families?
Councilor LaChapelle, would you like to answer that question?
No, I'm just looking at school-aged children, the children that are in school. So when I hear from the store next door, and I hear the gentleman get up in 250, I'm thinking, if we have 250 homeless children by themselves, no parents, no nothing, this is what I've been hearing. So I open it up for as many people and as many students that have nothing. So that's what I'm gearing to. Some of the other shelters are geared towards family. I know Hope Haven has family, and we're looking, in this shelter, it's geared, you said you can have more than 2 people in a room if it's a family, if it's related. So they do have some shelters for families. I'm looking at just the youth of our community.
Please continue. Or did?
No, I just want to say, number one, love the spirit of it, 110%, and just, I think the devil's in the details in terms of understanding it a little better, and I love the idea of digging into it a little bit more. Thanks.
If I may add, just to clarify, the existing services for families are pretty limited right now. Leeds is the only place that has family shelter, where the family can be together.
It's the only place in Androscoggin County?
Yes.
I see.
At least that's open to, that there's always some stipulations with some of the programming requirements, but that's generally a true statement. Hope Haven does shelter some adults with children. There is a division by gender, so children go with mom, so the family can't necessarily be together, and they don't have the 24/7, site access. So families are definitely underserved, and some of these homeless children that are cited in those statistics, are homeless with their parents. So that's just for everyone's consideration.
Director Hediger, before I take comments from the council, do you want to weigh in?
It's a great idea, but I think both staff and the committee just need to do some more research how that works programmatically. As Craig said, we should be talking to the school department. It's not clear to me if those 250 kids are truly homeless on their own, or are they homeless within a family setting. New Beginnings, they're offering some services now. We they're represented on the committee, so we have some good resources there as well. So I think it's a matter of talking to some of these other organizations and individuals to figure out if and how to make that happen.
Councilor Jelinas?
Thank you. Recognizing that that count does indeed include children who are part of a homeless family. I'm not an advocate of separating families. I do love the spirit of what you're recommending in terms of helping youth, but I feel very strongly about the family unit, and I feel very strongly about keeping children with their families whenever possible. The other thing that I would say is, while the goal would definitely be to have them be in school, no question, my concern with making that a stipulation is that part of being homeless, results in not being able to get to school. And I just feel like a lot of the families that we work with in my day job who are homeless would love their kids to be in school, but they're not in school because they can't be in school because it's like basic need stuff. It's just beyond getting there. So I'd love to have that be a goal, but whether that would be a qualifying stipulation, I'd be concerned about that. So I would just add that to the thought process a bit.
Councilor Clement?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I like the sound of what I've just heard. I think it is something that we should be looking into, perhaps some type of investigatory process. But if we can take X number of homeless children, and I heard the same thing from Mr. Potvin, and I've heard it before in our gatherings, that these aren't necessarily family children. They're children on their own. I don't know whether they chose to be, like, I'm not going to be home at 10 o'clock tonight, so therefore I'm out of here. Who knows why? But if we can take and turn them around when they're of that age, get them some schooling, get them some skills, so they don't become an adult drain on society, I'm all for that. And to that end, I think we should look into the matter further and see if there is some merit to it. I think it's a great idea.
Councilor Harriman?
Thank you. I do like the spirit of unlimited shelter beds for youth. I guess just one thing to add, I believe Mr. Potvin was speaking of the total number of homeless children in our school system, whether they are unaccompanied or with their family. So like others have mentioned, those children do have families, and it doesn't really make sense to me to separate them from their parents and not provide their parents with shelter as well. I also wonder how this would work in practice with shelters that provide shelter to families. Would the children would they not count towards the total number of beds if they're with their family? I'm just wondering how that would work. And then I strongly feel that being in school shouldn't be a stipulation for whether or not you get shelter, because I have never been homeless, but I'm sure it's very hard, and it's hard enough to get to school and do things, even if if you are living in a shelter. If you somehow lose that, are unable to get to school, and then you lose your shelter because of that, it just seems like it would be just a continuing cycle. So I don't feel that it should be tied to attendance at school. Thank you.
Did the shelter committee, you looked at homelessness here in Lewiston, Auburn, and Strong County. So is there any data as to how many homeless youth there are and how many homeless youth are homeless because their family's homeless? Do we have any reliable data for that?
I don't have that level of detail available in terms of how many of the youth are unaccompanied. I think that's what you're asking.
Yes,
don't
I
have
guess,
that
yes, thank you.
at this
Got it.
moment.
Okay. Councilor McCarthy.
As far as the whether they have to be in school or not, isn't there a state law that if you're under 17, you're supposed to attend school?
I believe there is.
Okay. Then what I would like to see would be something to the effect of that they need to be working towards being in school if they're not in school. As far as, it would bear upon the operators of the shelter to work with those students to get them to school. I mean, that's just following state law, and it would be to the benefit of the children, not only giving them a roof over their head, but a little nudge in the right direction when it comes to attending school. So I think if we could come up with some sort of language that said that they're, that the shelter's required to work with any underage children to get them into the school system, I would be comfortable with that. Thank you.
Counselor Scott.
Thank you. So, a couple of things. All of the students that are homeless are not necessarily unaccompanied. A lot of the students that are at New Beginnings don't necessarily go to the high school or the junior high. They do alternative programming, some of them, because of some different scenarios, many different scenarios. And I think that it would behoove us to have a little bit more information from the school department to try to determine. I know that when we look at our next agenda item and we look at the consortium plan that was done and that home ARPA funds, I believe the Lewiston School Department reported in there that there were upwards to 300 students that were unhoused. So I would like to find out a little bit more about that and get the validity on where that stands. I would also like to recognize, and I think it's a great idea, I myself want to focus on the youth in our community, but I think that it's important that we recognize also that we're talking about sometimes 3- and 4-year-olds that aren't even in school yet, that are with their parents, that are homeless and living in cars. So I would prefer that we look at maybe an unnumber of bed for families and children in general, and talk about further getting information on the school aspect. And I hear what you're saying, because I think it's really important that we encourage all of these kids to have the education they need. But what Councilor Jelina stated is a actual fact. We have parents out there that this is the least thing that they're worried about right now, because they're just trying to figure out where they're going to put their heads with their babies. And some of them have little children. So I would hate to put a number on that. I would be willing to compromise and go with 120 beds for a limit for another shelter, and we find some further information on exactly what's happening with our youth, getting New Beginnings again involved with this part of this conversation, getting the store next door, who has a very good understanding of what our homeless youth in our schools are experiencing, and look a little further for the specific numbers on that if we can. Every school year, we have a new set of numbers of the number of students that are in our schools. We have enrollments that are increasing a little bit here in Lewiston, so we might even see some different numbers as we get the full enrollment at the end of this month. But I think that that's a continuing thing. But I do appreciate an unlimited number of beds for students, and I think that it is where we need to focus. And as a matter of fact, on our next agenda item, that was one of the things I wanted to talk about in allocating some of that funds, if we can focus on our kids. That's where I'm at right now.
Councilor LaChapelle.
Mr. Mayor, might I propose or ask the question, because we're running into time crunch, and it's going to take some time to look at it, would we be willing to settle on 120 beds right now, with the request that the committee, I don't know if they do an extension or whatever, that we continue looking at this issue and come back to us with how to address the unlimited, pass something. I'm looking to pass something, instead of making the motion that we put another moratorium for 180 days until we come back. So I'm not in favor of that. I'd like to get something done on the books, go with the 120, and ask the committee to look into that, or form a new committee, whatever the case may be, and come back to us with the understanding that there is a flavor amongst the council to move forward with some kind of unlimited. I think you and I differ a little bit on some of it, but the foundation, I think, is where we're looking for. So just so we can move things forward, I don't think we're going to be able to pound something out tonight for the youth part, but I suggest then we go to the 120 beds and then ask the committee to come back. And I think there's a deadline on the committee. I don't know how long an ad hoc committee is good for. Does it last indefinitely, or is there a time period on an ad hoc committee?
Yeah, so we're, The committee is being extended until the end of the year, so
Okay.
there'll be time.
Wonderful. So I would recommend that they just dive into that issue and then come back to us as soon as possible so we can either add to it that factor. That would be my recommendation.
Thoughts on that, co-chairs?
Yeah, happy to do that work and try to come back with language that could work. And I think there'll still be, well, I'm hearing two pieces to that, but I guess if you're going to, am I hearing correctly that the temporary language is 120 bed limit for adult beds? Is that the way we're going to word it until at least we have better wording for it?
I'm looking at 120 beds shelter limit in the city of Lewiston right now, 120 beds. And then I'm looking at adding an unlimited amount of beds for, so if the law came into, if we passed it today, it's 120 beds, period. Man, woman, child, whatever, 120 beds. Come back, and I'm willing to just go unlimited for, yes.
Yeah, and we're talking about getting this extra part done in time for the whole ordinance to pass. We're talking about an amendment later.
An amendment later, just so we can get something passed right now, and then come back with an amendment later.
I don't think it's a good idea to, decrease the limit right now. Like, I think we settled on 134. I think we should keep 134. And if the council wishes to make changes and amendments later to, create another slot of shelter beds, they can at that time. But I'm, concerned about lowering the overall limit. Councilor McCarthy?
Thank you. My thought on this is that we go with the 120 limit and that we put in unlimited U18 or U19 beds, and then we can make a change whether we want to adapt that to include families or not, or at least something is in there so that moving forward, at least the students are covered. And then if we want to expand that to include families, I think that's a easier step than to add a whole nother category. This gets things moving now, and then we can tweak it after that. But I would like to see the unlimited use, however we want to word it. Like I said, because of Linda's thoughts on some of these children are in an alternative education or whatever, I think that limiting it to students is going to be too difficult. But if we limit it to the youths right now, it opens those beds up. And then if we want to tweak it for families, once we get the data back from the homeless shelter, it gives us a little more breathing room. Instead of just cutting it off right now, it opens it up some, and then if we open it up more, I think that's better progression. So that's my thought on it.
Councilor Harriman?
Thank you. There's been a lot of talk on this, and we could just simplify it by taking the recommendation of the shelter committee and just not having a cap on the number of shelter beds. And that would solve all of these issues, and we wouldn't have to come back with amendments and things like that. Thank you.
Councilor Clement?
I wholeheartedly disagree, and I would vote for 120 beds. I think that's where we need to go. We can enlarge it a lot easier than we can decrease it. And to set no limit to start with, I think we should start small and work up from there. I've said that before, I stick by it, and that's the way I'll vote. Thank you.
Councilor LaChapelle?
Thank you. I'm trying, folks. I'm trying. So we all have constituents that we're speaking to. We're all dealing with different issues. I feel 120 beds, we're moving it from 88 beds to 120 beds that we have in the city. So we're increasing that. You have a commitment from me that I will increase, I will vote to increase for the students. Now, how that comes about and discussing, I'm all for alternative education, I'm all for any of that. I'm not all for a recreational facility for 16-year-olds that are just going to be chilling and playing video games or whatever the case may be. I'm all for giving them the tools to move forward, similar to the tools that you're going to be providing with a full service, full turnaround shelter. You'll have those same services in a youth shelter also, which is still covered under Medicaid, Medicare, and you can have counseling, and that can be some of the requirements, like the requirements for time of stay. You can put requirements that they have to be in school within a certain amount of time. In school does not mean in a brick and mortar facility, Lewiston High School, whatever the case may be. It can be alternative schooling. It's just they're getting some kind of an education, and I'm 100% for that. I think we should move forward with the 120 right now, just to get something on the books, and just so we can move it forward. I'm afraid of it's too ambiguous if we just leave the no limit youth shelter. I think we need to define that more, just like what we're defining here. So that's my concern on just putting that down. So I'm all in favor of it. Let's just work on it together in good faith and move forward. But this gives us a chance to move forward now. So it's not like we're limiting them. There's nobody in the pipeline within the next 3 months that's going to put up a 70-bed shelter. And it's not going to, with this, in this environment right now, it's not going to happen that you have an unlimited shelters in Lewiston. That's not going to pass. So we can grandstand and talk about it, but let's try to see something that will pass, that we can move forward on. Thank you.
Councilor Harriman?
Thank you. Just to point out, we don't currently have an 88-bed cap. We have no cap at all. So whether it's
Councilors,
120
thank you.
or 134, it's not increasing the number of available beds. A cap would be decreasing the number of potential available beds, whether there's anything in the works or not. I just wanted to point out we don't have a cap of 88 beds. We have no cap right now.
Councilor, thank you.
So whether it's 120, 134, it's not increasing the number of beds that could be available.
Councilor Jelinas, did you have something to add? Further comment from the council? Councilor Scott?
Thank you. So I'm all in favor of compromise and working this through, because I think that whatever happens here, we have to do something because we have the need in our community. I felt, honestly, because I was in favor of no cap whatsoever, that we had made a compromise last week to the 134. But I'd be willing to do the 120 with the language in there that says unlimited to youth and family. I really think that that's imperative, important, and with the ability to look at it further, but getting the language in there now. I agree, I don't think something's gonna happen in the next 3 months, but once we vote on this, once we approve it, once we get this ordinance in place, that's the language that's out there, and I wanna make sure that that language goes out there with that in there. That's where I stand personally on this. I would want unlimited on youth and families. That's where I stand. And I'm willing to compromise to the 120. I'm not willing to compromise on the youth and the families. That's where I stand.
Just so we're clear, Councilor Scott, you're saying you're okay with 120, but
Well,
you're
no,
not.
not really. I'm not okay with 120. I wanted no cap last week. I felt like we compromised to 134.
If I may, Councilor.
Yeah.
Thank you. So you're possibly okay with 120, but not an amendment for youth and families. You would like that in for this current.
Correct. I want that in there now. So we have unlimited for our youth and families, and we'll compromise to the 120. I mean,
Okay.
we're doing
Just-
compromises here, right? We are working towards some of this language, and that's,
Yeah, no, I'm just trying to understand.
Okay.
Yeah, just to clarify.
Yep.
Thank you, Counselor. Counselor McCarthy.
Thank you. I happen to agree with Councilor Scott. I think that moving forward, we can I think we need some language in there, other than just the 120 cap. I'm comfortable with children and families for now, and then once we get the data, if we want to tweak that a little bit with an amendment, we can, but I would like to see it in there now. I agree with Councilor Scott on that. Thank you.
Counselor Clement?
I concur wholeheartedly with Councilors Scott and McCarthy. Thank you.
So if I'm, sorry,
If I might,
Counselors.
Mr. Mayor,
Or-
I'll
sorry.
make it crystal clear, 120 and the youth unlimited, which I believe is what I've heard from both of them.
Youth and
So I concur
families,
with them,
yeah.
youth and families. Yeah.
So if I'm understanding everybody correctly at this point, so we would go with the cap of 120, and then there would be an unlimited, there would be basically no cap on youth beds, and there would be no cap on family beds. Am I understanding that? Counselor LaChapelle.
Might I make this suggestion? We put that wording in and add to it the caveat with details to follow, or just let's put it in now, that's fine, but we have to find what's requirements after. So they're just saying unlimited youth and family, there's no different than saying, hey, go wherever you want, do whatever you want to do. I think, let's put that verbiage in there so that we can move forward, but add, I don't know how to do that, but add the details that we're gonna have more restrictions, I don't want to say restrictions, regulations as far as that aspect of it. There'll be some regulations that are coming, just so that we can move it forward. Or
Yeah.
Do you want to speak to that, Mr. Stoudemire?
Simply that I'm willing to do my best to turn around language for council's consideration that speaks to what Councilor LaChapelle is asking and gives the council, options to consider as we've been doing for some of these other pieces as quickly as possible.
Okay, thank you. And I guess my only concern with Councilor LaChapelle's, what was just said is, I'm concerned to that if it's one way, unlimited youth in shelters, and then people are concerned that it could be changing later, like it's kind of like in limbo. And I'm concerned to what that does to people proposing a shelter, et cetera. Like it's not clear. Councilor Clement?
To your point, Mr. Mayor, wouldn't everything be in that same vein? Somebody comes in to develop a widget factory, not knowing that we're going to change the regulation on widget factories 3 years down the road?
I understand your point. Thank
All
you.
right, thank you, sir.
I guess my point is that we're talking about it now and not 3 years down the road when we've uncovered something new. Councilor LaChapelle.
I guess then, if they're that adamant that they want it, I would vote just to keep to the 135 and eliminate the unlimited shelters altogether. So I want to,
The 134, you mean?
134, 135, 134, whatever, the 134, go back to where we were. I'm trying to hold something, I'm trying to get people to work, to compromise to do it. Let's talk about the whole family shelter thing. I don't think we have the time to bang it out to get it through right now. If you want to put the wording in it, that's fine, let's put the wording in it and continue working on it, knowing that we're going to come back and that we have children that are going to school, alternative school, whatever school, that they're getting educated, that's the whole goal of a lot of this stuff. And at least in my eyes, that we can help these youth, that they do not follow into that same horrendous cycle that we're in. So that's one of my, in speaking with the constituents, that I've been doing a lot of door knocking lately, That's one of the topics that have been coming up. We're not trying to sound like the big bad bear. I want to help people out, yes. I'm just saying, let's give this a chance, let's talk about it. And if we're going to, if you want to dive into it, we can dive into it. I don't think we have time. Put that wording in it saying that somewhere that regular standards, standards to come within the next couple months. Put a time period on it. We can work on it for the next few months. By January 1st, we can have verbiage on it. And it's going to take some time for anybody to build it. So to say the concern, that's not going to turn anybody away from opening it up. They know the feeling. When we start talking about zoning changes, we have businesses coming in already looking at properties because they know we're changing the zoning. Thank you.
So just to be clear, Counselor, you're advocating at this point to keep it at 134 and then to come back later with an amendment when there is more time to evaluate the number of beds for youth and family?
No. I'm looking at keeping the cap at 120, using that verbiage right now that the two councils from Ward 1 and Ward 2 suggested for unlimited bedding for youth and family with, in parentheses, or something that we're going to come back and make more regulations for that to at least get it. I don't even know if that's.
I guess
if
direct.
we can,
So you're saying make it unlimited for youth and families with the passing of this ordinance and come back and figure out the stipulations later?
that's what I'm, possible, yes.
That sounds.
That's what I'm trying to
Sorry, I'm
say,
not
suggest. Thank you.
Yeah.
I guess I'm just concerned with passing an ordinance, and then when you flip to the first page, it just says more details to come. And
Yeah, I don't think
Director
it's gonna-
Hediger, do you
I
wanna
don't think it's
speak to
going to
that?
say that. I think it's simply going to say 120, regular shelter beds, unlimited youth and families, period, with the understanding that there's going to be a commitment made by the committee staff to come back to you folks. And really, I mean, short of that, to your point, Mayor, we're not going to have language in there that says, and we're going to come back in 30 days from now. I mean, we're either going to adopt language, or the council's going to adopt language that clearly says what it is, or we're not. We're just going to delay it, and we're going to work on language and come back later on. So I think
that's a good compromise, personally, based on what I've heard. I think that's a good place to move forward. Just my 2 cents.
agreed. Counselor Scott.
Thank you. So that's where I'm sitting comfortable. That's what I was thinking too. This is still with the understanding, and we're not going to stop here, that the ad hoc committee is now going to focus more on the youth, the what is absolutely needed. And then we, as a council, if we decide when they come back with information that we need to add what you're suggesting, we're doing that. But we're putting this language in with, I didn't think it would have any definition on the side either in the parentheses saying more to come later on. That's not the way I was seeing it. I understand what you're saying though, because you want to ensure that we're all in agreement that we're going to talk about it later once more of this work is coming back. Am I understanding that? And that I am absolutely willing to say I completely agree with that.
And Counselor, if there was a concern that for some reason the committee doesn't produce, staff doesn't produce, you folks certainly have the ability at any time to initiate an amendment. You could just say, hey, we have issues, and I want to initiate an amendment because that whole 120 discussion we had, nobody followed through on it. Let's make a motion to amend that section of the ordinance. I don't think it's going to come to that. I think you have a great group of people here that are willing to take a look at that and come up with a solution. So I don't think it's going to be an issue. But I just want to make that clear, that there is a process here in case somebody didn't produce something for some reason, or it's not the expectation that folks are looking for.
And thank you, Director Hediger. In any event, all shelters would need to be approved by the council, correct?
The licenses.
The license, yes, the license would need to be approved.
Correct.
So there would be some oversight in that case. I think we're moving forward on that item. Councilor LaChapelle, did you have another item?
Yes. So since we had two fairly kumbaya moments, I'm going to hit on another topic that in discussing with constituents, the concern on no barrier and low barrier shelters. I am not in favor of them at all. And in low barrier, no barrier shelters, the thought of there should be no firearms, weapons, drugs, just a list of things that are not allowed in a shelter, period. No drug paraphernalia, just no fighting, and I know that some of that falls under the good practice, the common practice guidelines that they want to follow. But
The good neighbor?
Not just good neighbor, just good neighbor, but rules for the shelter itself.
Right, okay.
So that was
Best practices.
best practice, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I guess that was really the number one concern that I've been hearing from the constituents of Lewiston in regards to no barrier and low barrier shelters is just a mayhem. That's the thought that they can do whatever they want. They can, are we going to allow pets in the shelter? Can they bring an aggressive dog? Can they bring a snake with them? You laugh, yes, I won't tell you the stories, but there are snakes, birds, or whatever the case may be. So I'm truly believe that we should have no barrier and low barrier shelters excluded in the city of Lewiston and have some restrictions that define what we mean by no barrier and low barrier shelters. So that's where I start. This is going to be a conversation. That's why they call it a workshop. And I will let the committee and other members talk.
At this point, I will let the panel address this, and then we'll go from there.
All right, thank you. So we did, included in your packet was a memo speaking to this, and I'll summarize the main points of the memo. So, we did speak to this in the report on pages 38 and 39, but first of all, I'll say that put simply, the recommendation of the committee was, the licensing is already regulating a certain degree of programming with regards to shelters, and we've been discussing that. Hours of operation, the good neighbor agreement, those are programming requirements. What the shelter committee has recommended is that between the good neighbor agreement requiring the safety, security, and protective measures, the policy and procedures for those are submitted with the application, and that we're also asking for staff certifications for training relevant to the type of service and demographic of the guest being served. That also be provided as a part of the application process. So here's who you say you're going to serve. Show us that you actually are staffing and training your staff to a level that they are, qualified to serve this group of people in a safe and adequate way that, de-escalates conflict, helps refer them to the services they need. Those types of things that we've included in the licensing program is what we're trying to get at to address what we understood from the input we were getting to be concerns that folks have around the term low barrier shelter, which has become a bit of a loaded term, but we'll speak more to that. We're not recommending, and the ordinance it's not requiring that shelters be low barrier. So there are some shelters today that operate and require referrals for guests. There's some shelters that require very specific programming participation in religious worship and things like that. The ordinance is not requiring them to remove those barriers. Between each demographic group, funding sources, and the capacity of a shelter, there's a lot of very specific programming decisions that need to get made. Who are we going to serve? What's our ability to serve them? What kind of rules do we have to put in place, and objectives do we have to can we put in place? that we can meet and meet safely, et cetera. So, and you know, the practices are constantly updating as far as the funding sources, potentially other regulations. So I guess with all of that said, our suggestion is that we not regulate the programming decisions of shelters. Let them figure that out. And that's going in both directions. Again, in terms of not requiring higher barrier shelters to become low barrier, and not excluding low barrier. So that is the recommendation. And I guess I'll also add that, you know, low barrier shelter, and I can speak to more of the definitions in a moment, but low barrier shelter as it's defined by Maine Housing and HUD is considered a best practice. It's considered a good way to operate a shelter. So I do think that it's again, we're not requiring that shelters be low barrier, but it seems odd to take a best practice and say you can't do it here. With that said, we have developed 3 options for your consideration. If there is interest in talking about it more, I'm prepared to talk about the options that we're proposing that speak more to regulating low barrier, no barrier shelters from a few different angles. So I'm prepared to speak to those, but I will stop for the moment and hear what council has to say.
Anything to add, Ms. Smith or Director Hediger?
This time.
Okay. Councilor McCarthy.
Thank you. I'm looking at the additional ordinance language, which I think is what you were referring to. And I like option 1. The only caveat would be is I think sobriety has to be part of it. I heard a lot of concerns from neighbors, especially at the Armory when that one was open, that people going to the Armory were burying their drugs outside and then going into the shelter and then digging them up and using. And I think from a standpoint of safety, I don't think someone that's under the influence should be allowed in a shelter. I think there's substance abuse programs for those types of individuals. As far as I'm concerned, if you're offering someone shelter, they need to be willing to help themselves and stay sober while they're at the shelter. So option 1, it also says no barrier shelters are not permitted in Lewiston, which I agree with. So option 1 is great if you just add, in my view, if you just add sobriety into that. Thank you.
Councilor Jelinas?
Thank you, Mr.
Or,
Mayor.
whoa. Sorry, Councilor. Did you want to speak to that at all first?
Why don't I listen some more and then I'll address.
Fair enough. Councilor Jelinas, please proceed. My apologies.
That's okay. I would love to hear, you talk a little bit more about the options. From my perspective, I've done a whole lot of reading on this for sure, and I've learned a lot in the reading, and acknowledge, what you said about low barrier shelters being the best practice, and I understand that now better. I think if I just think about, human service delivery, and I think about, meeting humanity, sometimes, we're not all clean and tucked in, and while there might be some resistance to come one, come all, I think the reality is we can't necessarily separate individuals who are homeless from individuals who are experiencing substance use, from individuals who might have some mental illness, those kinds of things. And I don't think it's siloed like that, and I don't think we can go about, that is one of the reasons why I feel so strongly about the operational hours. I think the most valuable work that's going to be done in a shelter is going to be done during the day, frankly, addressing a lot of these issues. So I am of the mindset that, if we are going to serve the most vulnerable, if we're going to serve the most marginalized, we have to be open to the idea that they're not going to be all clean and tucked in and meeting all these rules. I I understand that. I mean, obviously, the goal isn't to have one big recreation center for everyone to come, come one, come all, and party all day. That's not the point. But the point is to recognize that it's not that tidy. It's not like that. And I want to hear more about the options. I know that I myself support a low barrier shelter for the reasons that I've come to just my own research and understanding what it is. I also feel like, having serving on the council, the mayoral council for substance use and recovery, we've learned a lot about different recovery approaches. And one of the, if we think about a no-door approach and really trying to, no closed doors approach and trying to think about where people come in their recovery journey, and there are lots of different ways to do that, many, many pathways. And one of the pathways is, MAT, medical assisted treatment. And that would, a lot of people that are really trying hard to become sober need to use different alternatives. It's not one size fits all. It's not necessarily having them sit in a prayer group and thinking that's going to be the end-all, be-all, way to get there. So I just would try to encourage open-mindedness in some of this, and would love to hear the options explained by you guys. Thanks.
Councilor Harriman?
Thank you. Yeah, I concur with Councilor Jelinas, and my question was just how, just from a legal standpoint, how would we define sobriety? Like, I understand if someone is, if someone is belligerent and posing a danger to other people, that would be a good reason for them to not be allowed entry. But yeah, I just don't know how we would define what sobriety means. Is it, you're not currently under the influence of anything, or you haven't used any substances in the last 24 hours? It just seems like it would be difficult to put into an ordinance. But I'd like to hear more about these options. Thanks.
Councilor Clement?
I agree with Councilor McCarthy so far on option one. I think sobriety is an issue. To Councilor Harriman's point, a common way of defining sobriety would be somebody who is at all under the influence of intoxicating liquor or illegal pharmaceuticals, or even legal pharmaceuticals to the point where they can't comprehend what's going on, make rational decisions, walk, talk, and act intelligently, that sort of thing. It's a very common definition. Police officers for years have testified as to sobriety. I believe perhaps the deputy city administrator will concur with that. A judge will ask, was he sober? No, sir, he wasn't. And that's all they want to know. They think that a police officer has the innate ability to be able to determine whether somebody's sober or not. If they're reeking of alcohol, can't stand up, that sort of thing, definitely not sober. But a common definition has always been at all under the influence. You mix alcohol in some of these settings and you're going to create problems, which we don't want. We want to get this off. We've come a long ways since this topic first came up. I think there's been compromise from all sides here. I think we're heading towards something that's viable. We're not quite there yet. I trust that we will be. I think there are a few more little things we have to nuance around a little bit, but I think we're very close to coming up with something now. And to sit back and we can argue forever what is. But sobriety is very easy, I think, to determine. The common person can tell you whether or not somebody's sober. My view. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor. Councilor Scott?
Thank you. So just going from recollection and reading some of these options, when we had the emergency shelter, I believe that this was some of the stuff that they were running under. Somebody would show up probably in an intoxicated state, but they were not allowed to continue drinking while on the premise, in the program, or doing any sort of drugs, paraphernalia if they had. And I believe that some of the language that you have in option one describes that specifically, that you're denied entry if you're carrying a weapon, exhibit violent behavior, are in possession of illegal substances, drug paraphernalia. I would be willing to add in that there's no drinking on the premise while using the facility. Don't know that, in speaking to Councilor Jelinas' point, that you're going to get people to necessarily show up sober or leave and go out and go do the substance abuse that they are in that predicament that they're in. without getting the help. And I think that what we're looking at, when we're looking at some of our language here, and what we were talking about with a low barrier shelter, is having those services in place so that people are getting the ability to get help with those things that are that are actually inhibiting them from being homed, which we know is the statistic that a lot of the homeless people do have these issues with sobriety, with drug addiction, with mental health issues. And providing those services in a shelter that we have, I think we have to have some lenience in that respect. You can't do it while you're there. You cannot have weapons, you cannot be drinking, you cannot be doing drugs while you're there. And I would agree that I think I've heard from a lot of people that no barrier shelter is something people are very concerned about. I would be more, I think that what Mr. Saddlemeyer had said, that this is, best practices for a low barrier shelter, I agree with. But I think that we'd be hard pressed to get the community to rally around a no barrier shelter.
So I think there's a little bit of confusion where low or no barrier shelter equates with no rules, and I don't think that's the case. My concern, and after this I want you to speak to the options, but my concern is that we need to meet people where they are and lift them up. There's a certain amount of, the idea is that we're going to make a dent in the homeless problem here in Lewiston, and I'm concerned that if there is not at least a low barrier shelter, that will, there are currently homeless on the street right now that are not being taken in by our current high barrier shelters, and that won't improve the situation if a low or no barrier shelter isn't allowed under the new ordinance. Previous Councilor Saddlemeyer, will you speak to the options?
Sure. Well, since I'll start with the sobriety piece, I guess, since that's been the major point of interest so far. And I have been trying to research this and get some input on all of this. And I guess the first thing I'd say, from putting some of the legal stuff aside, from the community standpoint, I think I understand what I've heard as far as public concerns about admitting people who are not meeting the standard of being visibly sober, is that it's rewarding drug abuse. That's the public concern that I've heard, is that the shelter is rewarding it by allowing them in. I think the other piece to consider is, and I think if you talk to anyone, mental health experts and folks that work with people who are dealing with addiction, if you want people to be able to control or beat their addiction, having stable housing is like a huge factor in that. So the path to getting housed in some cases is through a homeless shelter, and that having that level of stability can then potentially enable them to control or address their addiction. Along with that, if for people who are dealing with addiction, I guess we're not these are not homeless shelters are not the community's detox centers. That's a specific type of service. But for folks who are homeless and struggling with addiction, if they meet those categories as a community, do we prefer that they are struggling with their addiction in public on the street, or are they getting into the shelter and then having that shelter connect them with the services they need to become permanently housed and to get services to address their addiction issues. So that's a community question, I think, to consider as we discuss this. Another piece to it, I think, from the regulatory standpoint, if sobriety were going to be added in here to say, you know, your guests must be sober, the city policy might say as much as that, and then the applicant basically would be proposing how they're going to assess that, and then the city could determine whether that approach to assessing it was adequate or not, which is the case with, I think, a lot of these, you know, like, yeah, tell us your safety procedures. We're not telling you exactly what your safety procedures are, but tell us what your safety procedures are. If they say, my safety procedure is, you know, I have no procedure, then the city would say, that's not good enough, like, show us something real. So it'd probably be something to that effect. But another thing that I was advised on was that you know, addiction is being treated from a legal perspective more and more as a disability. So to deny services to someone that is dealing with addiction and some of the symptoms of that, again, putting aside, safety is one threshold where if someone's being aggressive, whether they're sober or not, if someone's exhibiting violent or aggressive behavior, you know, behaviorally that can be a reason to exclude them from a shelter. But if it's simply intoxication, some shelters do that now, and they use their own standards for sobriety to do that. For the city to codify it may be, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not saying that I'm certain about this, but the city might be setting itself up for some human rights claims as far as that goes, if it were to require it. That's the summary of the thinking and the feedback that I've gotten on that particular item. And I guess with that, I'm happy to talk about the options next if folks are ready for that, or
Please proceed.
okay. So the first option is, so all of these are adding this new piece that's saying during the application for a license, the shelter is going to submit their policy for describing the criteria for applicants to register as guests upon entry, and then the criteria to remain as shelter guests after they've entered. So all the options are asking for that. And then option one is it's defining a no barrier shelter, and then saying the city does not allow no barrier shelters, which, again, based on public comment, I think when people have heard low barrier, no barrier, I think no barrier is what they're imagining. At any rate, low barrier has been the term that we've been using the most in some of these public debates. So this says no barrier shelters are not allowed. And then it provides a definition of low barrier shelter that I think is accurate, is consistent with the way Maine Housing and HUD would define it. It's not their official definition. It's kind of the way they define it, and I'll get to that in a moment, is more relative to higher barrier shelters. This definition is defining it relative to no barrier shelters for the purpose of this ordinance. So it's making that distinction, and then it's also carving out these two pieces, which are just standard for shelters that serve survivors of domestic violence, human trafficking, and sexual exploitation. The identity piece and outstanding warrant for an arrest is just, it's something very specific to how they operate. So there is a carve out there for them. So that's option one. Option two is on its own. Option two, it's not getting into the definitions so much as just setting the floor for, a policy that every shelter has to have. So again, it's saying during the licensing process, you got to submit your criteria for admitting guests and for them staying there. And then it requires all shelters to maintain a policy whereby entry and service is declined to any guests who carry weapons or exhibit violent behavior, are in possession of illegal substances or drug paraphernalia. And I did hear the suggestion of adding alcohol to that, which I think makes sense, is in the basically I think intended here. do not observe the shelter safety rules, have an outstanding warrant for their arrest, or refuse to identify themselves. It's got the same carve out there for 2 items for survivors of domestic violence and human trafficking and sexual exploitation. So that's option 2. Option 1 and 2, I think, are accomplishing pretty similar things, but approaching it from a different angle. Option 2A is building upon option 2, but adding a couple more pieces. One thing it's adding is a definition of a low barrier shelter, and that definition is a copy and paste, basically, from Maine Housing's definition. Then it's allowing certain shelters that serve children, youth, or the survivors to be low barrier shelters. And then the third piece is basically saying for the general population of homeless adults, it's basically it's adding a requirement, and it's saying as a part of your application, pick a requirement for entry that needs to be met within 24 hours of registration at the facility, and tell us what that requirement's going to be and how you're going to enforce it. So those are the options. Again, none of them, the committee has not had a chance to meet. I have gotten committee input on this in crafting it. So none of these options are endorsed by the committee. The committee's original recommendation stands, but we did prepare this so that council could have something to consider as we get closer to making the ordinance a reality. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions or what the council has.
Councillor Clement.
Very briefly, Mr. Mayor, I have a problem with item 5. If they have a known outstanding warrant for their arrest, this could put your shelter in potentially a position of harboring somebody. If they know there's a warrant for their arrest and they bring them in and shelter them, I don't think you want to do that. Then they could end up being charged. I think we need to run that past legal counsel to make sure that that's something that's viable.
Yeah, and the carve out there is only for the shelter serving survivors of domestic violence, human trafficking, and it's from them that I got that, and I am not an expert beyond what I've said.
Well, I don't know of any statute that exempts any particular class of person from an arrest warrant. That's all I'm getting at. And the statutes are quite clear. If you knowingly harbor somebody that's wanted for something, then you yourself could get yourself in a bind. I mean, there may be a way around that, and that's why I suggest that's what lawyers do.
Yeah, I agree.
They create hedge words and wiggle words. And
Right. I agree, yeah.
okay.
Administrator Hunter, will this, am I to understand that this ordinance has not been reviewed by council yet?
No, because we didn't have the final language.
And will it be reviewed by council before we go to the first public hearing?
That is the goal.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, further questions for our panel? Councilor McCarthy.
The reason why I was talk about sobriety is I mean, the reality is this isn't utopia. We can't save everybody. And I don't think short term or near term there will be enough shelter beds for everybody. So my thought process is that people who are sober are more likely to move on from being homeless and getting a stable job and stable housing. And that's why I think we should focus our resources on those people that have the best chance of making it out of being homeless. And with that in mind, I would not want people who do have that prospect from not getting shelter beds, and the shelter beds go to people who don't care to be sober. They just want a place to sleep, and they'll, like I said, they'll bury their drugs outside, they'll come in, they'll sleep overnight, and then they'll go out and they'll shoot up and be stoned and come back to the shelter the next day, that night. So that's why my focus, I believe, is, especially short term, is we need to focus on the people that most likely can make it. and will get the most help out of the shelter, the best hand up from the help they get from the shelter. Thank you.
Councillor Scott?
So just for clarification, in reading this, am I understanding that each one of these options says at the very beginning, during application for license, homeless shelters must submit their policy describing criteria for applicants to register as guest upon entry and criteria to remain at the shelter as guest after entry, which means in my mind, when they're applying for their application, and if part of that process is to come before the city council, they need to give a full criteria and rundown on how they're going to handle each one of these situations, which could include the sobriety. Am I wrong?
It gives the
Am I
option.
understanding that?
Yes, it gives the option for a shelter to propose that sobriety would be a condition of entry, but it's not requiring that all shelters do that, as it's currently written.
But a shelter could come to us with an application for a license and say, this is how we would handle if somebody comes to us. Or could we, in the licensing, ask that question?
Yeah, so I think I understand your question, and that, I guess that gets back to the piece that is required right now, which is, we're asking for, what's the level of training your staff are receiving? So,
Right.
Yes, that's something that would be raised for anyone. If you're looking to serve folks that may be intoxicated, are you trained to deal with that? Do you have the resources to support folks that are in that situation? If not, then maybe you should not be admitting them. That would be part of the application discussion.
Okay, so in my understanding of that, I think that would answer some of what you're asking, because we would be looking at that, and if we felt as a council that this particular shelter, as they're going for their license, doesn't have the criteria or the staff or the way to, we could actually say we deny that license, correct?
If you thought the training was not adequate, I haven't really gone through license denials before. David might be able to speak to that more, but yeah, I think that.
Right.
I think it sets up the opportunity for the council to say, the training's not sufficient for the level of service you're talking about providing.
And I think that gives us as a council, in some of our fears of how these shelters would be, the opportunity to say, we're not comfortable with this particular shelter because we don't feel you have enough safety things in place. And instead of having to put all of this specific language in place that we may not necessarily have the understanding of, or what a shelter is going to come to us with the ability to handle these different situations. We may have one that has the staffing and all of that in place, and another one that doesn't, and we go, we don't want that. We need more from you in order to approve a license from you. And I'm thinking, instead of adding that specific language in there to put more oversight from the council on this, we've got the ability as the council to deny a license if we feel it's not meeting that requirement that we feel our community needs, is I guess what I'm trying to say.
You're saying that if the shelter applicants don't provide the level of expertise or experience necessary, we could deny them their application?
Correct.
Right, if we were not comfortable.
Correct.
Right, okay. Counselor, before I take further, I just want a clarification. So when, the shelter beds that are available each night, occasionally there are some beds, of the total number of shelter beds available each night, some beds are available. And I think you had mentioned in a previous meeting that they are available simply because the people who are homeless do not they're high barrier shelters, and so they will not take people who would otherwise be able to be accepted into a lower no barrier shelter. Is that accurate?
If I understood the question correctly, there are people that who are homeless in our community who do not gain access to existing shelters. One, because in many cases shelter beds are full. And then secondly, there are some people that are seeking shelter that, cannot meet all of the standards in place that some of the shelters have. So a low barrier shelter would be supporting some of those folks. I mean, some of those folks, may still not get entry for another reason.
Right,
I don't
okay.
know, but more of them would be served.
Thank you. Councilor LaChapelle?
Thank you. Coming back to a question I asked earlier, with the shelter, if I had my pet snake around my neck, would I be allowed to enter into the shelter?
I don't know. I'm not familiar with how pets are handled. I think, a shelter can certainly deny I can understand why a lot of shelters would want to prohibit snakes from being in the shelter. That makes a lot of sense to me. I am not personally familiar with how pets, particularly pets that are, I think if getting back to the general safety piece is I think any animal that's considered to be a threat or aggressive, I would expect just about any shelter to not admit. If a pet is a service animal, which is a very specific definition, I think they would need to admit
It's not a pet, it's a service animal at that point, and it's
Right.
a licensed service animal.
Right,
So
I
I'm
agree.
not addressing that at
Yeah,
all.
yeah.
I'm addressing pets
Yeah.
in general.
Yeah.
Okay, so, thank you.
Yep.
And to follow it up, I guess I would agree with Councilor McCarthy, and I would like just to add pets excluded. Basically, it's going to come down to, at some point, the city of Lewiston is going to have to fess up some money on this. And I know my constituents, if the comment that I get, if they do not have the funds to take care of themselves, why do they have a dog that they're having to take care of? Why are they having this to take care of? And a service animal is a huge difference from a pet. I'm all for the service animal, the licensed service animals. So I would agree with option number one and adding pets, and then the not allowing them to be doing drugs or drinking on the premise. If there's nothing that, I'm not in favor of just saying, just because you're drunk tonight, you can't come into the shelter. That's not the point. You had a bad night, whatever. The next 10 days, I'm gonna be sober and it's gonna be fine, whatever the case may be. But you're not allowed to drink in the shelter. This is not a safe haven for activities that,
Yep, that can definitely be added. Yeah.
if you have the money to drink, you can have the money to take care of, take a shower, to do some of the other things. Now, I understand alcoholism, but that's gonna fall under the treatment facilities that you provide, and that full-service shelter would be helping people in that aspect. So I would be in favor, option number one, pets, and then drugs and alcohol.
Yep,
And so I'd be in
Noted.
favor of option number one with that.
noted.
Further comments from the council, or do we have consensus on this? No? Okay. I'll take that as a yes.
I have 4.
I'm sorry?
I have 4. I've been making little.
You have four what?
4 consensus.
Heather's
for option
counting.
1.
Oh, I see. Okay. Did you have anything else to address, Councilor LaChapelle?
At this time, I'm going to hold off and thank you for your indulgence.
You're welcome. Does anybody have anything else to add to this discussion? Anything from the two of you that are remaining?
I know we're not quite done, but I mean, I feel like we've had some really productive conversations throughout this process, and it's obviously, a subject that a lot of people feel strongly about, so I'm just appreciative that we've remained engaged in the discussion. I think folks are making some very reasonable compromises, and just expressing my gratitude.
Are you all set there, Director Hediger?
Do we need to talk about timeline here, just so everybody's aware of what's going to be happening?
I think that would be most appropriate.
Okay.
Could I just jump in, guys? Also, I appreciate everything. My daughter just had a baby, so I'm going, okay? But thank you so much. Sorry, guys, I just.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
But thank you.
All right. It's like the best excuse ever, so.
Yeah.
That was the champagne.
It was.
As your council adopted a moratorium. Moratorium expires on September 25th.
Yes.
As I mentioned, we need to get the planning board involved. We got to come back to you folks for 2 hearings as well. So I've kind of laid out a scenario here under the best case scenario as to how this may fall out if there's no delays by either the council or the planning board. So we have the direction from you folks tonight as to how to proceed on drafting the ordinance. The next meeting would be the city council on the 6th, where you folks would do a public hearing and first passage on the proposed changes. And that'd be continued to the next meeting like normal. But that's going to be contingent upon getting a recommendation from the planning board. So the planning board needs to act upon those changes to the zoning and land use code. And that's going to include a definition of low barrier now as well, because that's something new that we just added here as well. So that will be a consideration for the planning board as well. September 12th, planning board holds a hearing to provide a recommendation on those changes. That recommendation gets forwarded to you folks, and that would be on the 20th. Great. The moratorium expires on the 25th, so there would be a potential window of opportunity there for anybody to come in and get a shelter, because ordinances don't become effective until 30 days after you folks take action. So there is going to be this 4-week window of opportunity where somebody potentially could come under the standards that exist today. Conditional use board, planning board, limited to those 2 districts. No performance standards, no nothing. An option for you folks certainly is to extend the moratorium. I think your intent from day one, and it's been reiterated tonight, is no one's looking to delay this any longer than necessary. So you don't necessarily need to extend a moratorium for 180 days. You could extend it to a date certain. You could extend it to a date certain or upon adoption of the ordinance, whichever is sooner. But you folks might want to consider that. And if you do consider that, you could make these motions at your meeting on the 6th. So in addition to the first reading and first passage and directing it to the planning board, you folks could also have another item on the agenda that evening to extend the moratorium. And what the council did with the adoption of this moratorium and previous councils without moratoriums is you suspended the rules so you could do both readings in one evening that night. So we wouldn't have to have 2 hearings for purposes of the moratorium. So with all that said, that's under the best case scenario, that everything goes smoothly with the planning board, everything goes smoothly with you folks. The city attorney doesn't turn this thing upside down and has substantive changes that need to come back. So my suggestion would be for you folks to actually extend the moratorium. How long, that's up to you. I don't think you're going to need a lot of time, but I think that would probably be the cleanest route, and it gives you folks somewhat of a buffer and also provides the open understanding that you guys are looking to move forward and have this adopted here without further delaying it another 6 months.
So under state statute, can the council extend the moratorium for a set period of days?
You can do it, moratoriums for 180 days, and statute allows you to do one extension of another 180 days.
Up to 100?
Yes, up to 100.
Up to 180 days. Okay, so the council could adopt like a 30-day extension, like, okay.
Right. And my caution with doing that is only, is it going to go as smoothly as we hope it does? I don't know. So if 30 days expires for some reason and we're still having this discussion here, you'll still have that window of opportunity. Do any of us think that somebody's waiting in the wings with a 40-bed shelter right now? Probably not. But, something to just be aware of.
Mr. Mayor?
Councilor McCarthy.
Yeah, I would be in favor of the moratorium being extended till the ordinance is adopted, or till the new ordinance is in effect, would be the wording that I would go along with. The reality is the ordinance, 99% of the ordinance is pretty much determined now, so you're not holding anybody up as far as their planning process, they know what's coming. It may get tweaked a little bit, but they know that's coming. So that if anyone has an issue with us just trying to follow through on our plans and what we were trying to do all along, this has been a complex problem that we're trying to address. The committee has put a heck of a lot of work into this, provided the information to us. We have to digest that, and then we have to do due process with the planning board and, the readings and everything else. So people need to realize that it's not an ideal situation as far as it's not finite. It's, it's only going to take us 180 days. No, 180 days is what we had hoped for. We didn't make it. So I think that I think most reasonable people will understand that if we extend the moratorium until the new ordinance is into effect, they'd go along with it. Thank you.
Sorry, 1 second, Councilor. Director Hedegaard, so you have here 9/12 is a planning board hearing. Do they need to meet before then, or that is when they will consider the zoning changes?
That's when they would consider the zoning changes.
Okay. All right. Councilor Clement.
I would agree with Councilor McCarthy. I think we extend it just to cover us until the proposed ordinance, which I think we're very close to, is effective, would cover us. I mean, the chances, I don't know what the chances are any more than I know we're going to be at nuclear war next week. But I do think in order to cover us, if somebody comes in under the existing rules, which essentially are nil compared to what we've proposed, then we've defeated ourselves in the process. Extend the moratorium up until the date that's effective. I mean, you could put a maximum date on it. I don't think we need 180 days, probably 30, 45 days, something like that, or when the ordinance becomes effective, whichever is sooner. I think that's reasonable.
Is that language supported under state law? The idea that we can have, it's not a set date. It's just, we need the moratorium until our new ordinance takes effect, or do we need to provide a specific date?
I think you're putting in a date or the effective date, whichever is sooner.
I think, Mr. Mayor,
Okay.
we could rescind the moratorium at any time if we wanted to by vote of the council.
Correct. And what is the process for that, or how long would that take? To rescind the moratorium? Let's say the council did 180 days, because we're kind of not sure how long, if this timeline is completely accurate. And the process to rescind, what does that look like?
It's a public hearing, because the moratorium is technically an ordinance, so we'd be having a public hearing on that as well, but that's a one-meeting event that you folks could do. I'm thinking you could probably suspend the rules on that as well. I would probably look to Heather or Kathy to confirm that, but no different than adopting it and adopting it in one meeting. You could rescind it in one meeting as well.
And would there be a waiting period with that, or it would happen at that vote?
No, because you have the other ordinance that's potentially been adopted with an effective date. So you're going to rescind it, and I mean, I'm not sure that this would ever even happen, right, as far as having to rescind it, because you potentially have adopted an ordinance with an effective date already in there. So the likelihood of this rescinding process is slim. But for it to happen, I'm not answering your question, I feel.
I think I'm good for right now.
Okay.
Councilor Harriman.
Thank you. Just a procedural question. If we were to extend the moratorium, does that require a public notice, and because it's amending an ordinance?
Right, yeah, essentially it's a new ordinance again that we're extending. So that's why we'd be having a public hearing potentially on the 6th to extend that moratorium.
And there'd have to be notice ahead of time?
Yep.
Ahead of them?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Councilor Jelinas.
Thank you. So I just want to make sure I'm clear on this. The primary reason for wanting to extend the moratorium is to eliminate the possibility of an existing shelter or somebody new coming in that little window of time and making change. It's not, I just go back to like when this moratorium was voted on, and that was a pretty contentious, there's a lot of testimony about that, a lot of, public speaking out. And I remember what we said as a council. I remember what we said. And I'm just trying to understand the rationale. I want to make sure that that is the primary reason.
From my perspective, that's the only reason, is to avoid having a window of opportunity where somebody may come in
Do
with
you
a
really
shelter
think-
that,
And we think that could happen.
I have no idea if that's gonna happen. No one has talked to our department, you know, about pursuing
Right.
any sites or anything, so
Right.
I would think the likelihood's pretty slim.
Right. Thank you.
And that would have to coincide with a planning board meeting as well, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. Counselor Scott?
Thank you. So I'm just going to be honest here. I never thought we needed a moratorium in the first place. 4 weeks, I'm willing to take that risk. I will not vote to extend this moratorium, and that's the way I feel. I think we've done some tremendous work here. I greatly appreciate the work that the ad hoc committee has done, the work of Director Hediger, and the work of Heather this evening in making sure that she's written down everything that we've said. I mean, this has been a lot of work. We've done a lot of compromising, but I'm going to have to stick to my guns with this. I never thought we needed the moratorium in the first place, and I will not vote to extend it, though I will say that I am very happy that we've come to agreements on this ordinance, and I'm happy with the work that's been done with this, and that's where I stand. Thank you.
Counselor LaChapelle?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Director Hediger, is the only reason why this is going for the planning board is because of that zoning to look at the urban and that? Is that the only reason for it?
There is a definition of shelter that's changing, as well. What was originally being proposed, there was a new definition for shelter. Now we have the low barrier definition that will be added there, and then the zoning districts.
And no barrier is another definition.
Excuse me, and the no barrier.
And that has to go before the planning board?
Correct.
Okay.
And
So procedurally, we can't vote here tonight, so there's nothing that's gonna go in concrete. The next time we get together, how would this, I would be in favor of extending the moratorium with the language, whatever comes first, once it's passed, or at the end. As soon as it's passed, do double reading, whatever, so we can get it pushed through immediately. I would be in favor of that. We're not voting tonight, so how does this come on the September 6th?
Well, I would suggest to the council at this point, and just to clarify, Director Hediger, the planning board meeting will not, that is not the limiting factor here. We're talking about the required time, the time to take effect.
In order for the ordinance as drafted or presented at this point, there are changes that involve the zoning and land use code that require a recommendation from the planning board. So until that occurs, there's a portion of this that would not be adopted by the council.
Right, but that doesn't that happens before the meeting on the 20th. Like
That's
the plan,
correct.
the plan.
That's correct.
I guess what the point that I'm trying to make is that the fact that this is being evaluated by the planning board does not hold up the timeline.
It could, because on the 20th, you're supposed to have a recommendation from the planning board that supports whatever the zoning changes are, definitions, whatnot. Ideally, the planning board's gonna make a recommendation on the 12th. I suppose there's a case where they could say, staff, come back with more information about the zones, because we're not sure that we want to expand it into these zoning districts. If that were the case, the council wouldn't be taking action on the 20th, then, because you wouldn't have a recommendation on that portion of the ordinance.
Point well taken. I think at this point, it makes some sense. Yeah, if the majority of the council feel that a moratorium needs to be in place until it's enacted, then perhaps prepare one for September 6th. And that will simply be an agenda item with a public hearing, correct?
Correct. Yeah, my intent in bringing this to your attention is just so there wasn't any surprises. Because obviously, I remember the comments made too 180 days ago that you guys were looking to get this done. And, you know, to Councilor McCarthy's part, I don't think anybody's been a slouch at all in this whole process here. So hopefully that would be recognized. But I just want folks to be aware of what potential consequences or outcome could occur depending on the process here.
Okay, thank you. Anything further about the timeline, Director Hediger?
No, I think at this point, we'll work on the ordinance. We will also work on a moratorium for the board's consideration. And we'll draft everything with the intent of trying to meet these timelines here, and we'll see how it pans out.
Councilor Clement, do you have something to add?
Just, I think a directive to staff on this to make sure that the continuation of the moratorium is the least restrictive possible to get us to the enactment date of the ordinance. In other words, we don't want to go 45 days, 90 days, whatever. Get us up to the date where the ordinance becomes effective. We're right on the cusp of passing that now, and I think people will understand why we're doing this. I certainly hope so. We've asked them to trust us on this matter. I think we've come a very long ways. A lot of compromise, a lot of discussion, a lot of great work by the Shelter Committee. I will commend them for that. You know, and I think we're there. We've just got to bring it to the finish line now.
Thank you. Okay, I think we're good.
Just one.
Councilor McCarthy.
Yeah, I just wanted to weigh in on the moratorium. I'm leery of putting a time frame as far as numerical days, only because if we run into a legal issue or planning board stubs their toe or something like that, I think if we just, it's clear, once the ordinance is in effect, the moratorium disappears. And I think it's short, sweet, to the point, and it doesn't involve any counting days. I mean, there's no one on this council that wants to drag this out any longer than we have to. So I don't want to. We would be remiss in opening up a window just for the sake of how it looks to the general public. All we're doing is keeping the moratorium in place. We've got the ordinance written. It's almost ready to go. We're just dotting our I's, crossing our T's, and getting it into place. So I would prefer the wording of the agenda item would be till the proposed ordinance takes effect. Thank you.
Understood, Councilor McCarthy. I think Director Hediger will be doing just that. Councilor Harriman, did you have something to add?
Yes, thanks. I just wonder if that sort of language is permissible under statute. It just seems very, very wishy-washy, and I just wonder if that would hold up legally to say contingent on something that might happen at some time.
I will clarify that with the city attorney. I think we need to make it crystal clear as a follow-up whereas in the agreement that in no instance does it exceed the 180 days. That's the piece that we need to be cognizant of.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate the council. I appreciate you, Director Hediger, Craig Sotomayor, and Amy Smith. Thank you all so much. I think we're ready to move on to the next workshop item.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brief recess.
We will take a brief recess and reconvene momentarily. And we're back. We're now having a workshop on the home ARPA funds. And Director Jeffers, will you start us off?
I will do so.
Yes, Director Jeffers.
You got it right.
Yes, okay.
No, and I appreciate the opportunity. I've got 13 slides here. I realize it's already been a relatively long night for you folks. Some of this overlaps with what you were just discussing. I will try to get through the slides quickly. A lot of it's just the foundation of home, how we've typically spent it, and where we'd like to go from here. You know, it's a federal grant program. It's really supposed to be used to provide or create affordable housing. It's something that Congress allocates money every year, and we typically get $210,000 to $270,000 annually is our share of it. We have historically used our funds for building mixed income or low-income housing, workforce development type housing. You might have a 35-unit project. We will put $250,000, $300,000 of home into it. 2 of those units will be allocated as home units. The rest are funded by other funding sources. But this really just helps us leverage and help make projects happen. In the past, we have also used it for home funds, for homeowner rehab, loans, and security deposits for the homeless and to help the nearly homeless. And are we having technical difficulties from, I see counselors spinning. No signal.
The counselors all have a great seat, but I'll survive. Please continue.
Okay. We got a special pot of money just last year. It was a $1.7 million and change, which is a special allocation from Congress, but it came with the caveat that we used it to address homelessness. The Lewiston share of that funding is $799,389. HUD regulations only allowed the funds to be used for the 4 items here, which was to develop new affordable rental housing for the homeless, develop or acquire, renovate non-congregate shelters, provide supported services to the homeless, or provide tenant-based rental assistance to the homeless. That's effectively working like Section 8 certificates. There are qualifying populations. Again, this was part of the home regulations. It was homeless, at risk of homeless, and the way they help define that is if a household has an annual income below 31% of the area median income. I put up the the income levels there. You know, $16,750 for a 1-person household, up to $27,750 for a 4-person household. There's criteria for up to families of 8, but those are the ones that we most typically see with homeless populations. Or if a household is spending 50% or more of their income on housing costs. Other categories are unaccompanied youth, and they had the caveat up to under age 25. People who are fleeing domestic violence, stalking, assault or dating violence, and homeless veterans. There was a very specific mandated process for planning. Jessica Wilson on our staff, our Community Development Program Manager, and I always get her title off, but she's the one who really is the rule keeper and knows the regulations better than I. She really ran the process, and the HUD mandated that you have to talk to the continuum of care for your state. You should talk to homeless providers, domestic violence. Here's the list. Let me go to the folks on the next slide who we actually did talk to. And again, I won't read all of these to you, but it was a very comprehensive group. We talked to the police and fire departments. We talked to the school departments. We talked to Adult Ed, New Beginnings, Safe Voices, Veterans Inc. The list goes on. It was a good list. We had a lot of good positive feedback. Really helped us identify where there were gaps in funding and really where there were needs for funding. We also did community surveys. Both cities did them independently. A total of 362 surveys representing over 1,000 residents were received. In Lewiston, 61% of them were homeowners, so this was not just the homeless population who was responding, it was a broader spectrum of people. 30% of those who responded to the survey in Lewiston actually worked with those qualifying populations. So I thought it was a pretty good cross-section of people who participated in the process. We were glad to have it. We have had public notice. First time was July 14th. There was a 15-day public comment period back in May. Auburn first rolled out their draft of the plan, which was just their side of the of the plan. It did not include Lewiston's. There was really no comment received at that point. Auburn Council did take action on the plan that I shared with you last week at their August 1st meeting. No public comments were received at any of those public hearings or during the comment period. To give you a sense of the challenge, I found going through, you probably have seen this chart. This was from the Continuum of Care. And part of the reason this is such a precipitous increase in the number of homeless counted on that point-in-time survey that's done every January is that for the first time they included the data from folks that are put up in hotels and by general assistance. And it also included the emergency income payment program that Maine Housing rolled out, Community Concepts was rolling it. So that was pretty telling, but right at the bottom of the chart, you'll notice for the unsheltered population, there was still a small increase. And I suspect it's really covered on this slide. It was 300% of those were sheltered, but only 15% in the unsheltered counts. And it makes sense that the unsheltered counts went up at a higher level, but it's a difficult population to count. But seeing such a significant incline, it makes sense that the unsheltered counts increased as well. Case in point, Safe Voices had 325 people wanting to use their shelter, but they could only house 83 individuals. There were almost 2,100 households in Lewiston who received emergency rental assistance under the Maine Housing Program. Part of the challenge is local vacancy rates are below 3% at this point. We have 75 Lewiston households with Section 8 certificates who have the certificates. They're looking for, they just can't find housing. You see in orange, that was my own note to myself to fill that out. I went back and forth with Maine Housing today, or not Maine Housing, Lewiston Housing Authority. They said they have about 475 people on their waiting list for Section 8 certificates any month. They clear it out at the end of the month, but you know, it's just rolling, but they just want to keep it fresh, so you have to keep reapplying. Part of the reason that they clear it out is even if they gave certificates out, they can't find housing. So that's been the challenge. This is a breakdown on how we have used home funds. This is what you folks approved this past May. We had a total budget of new money of $247,100 from the Home Consortium. We spend a little over $14,000 of that on administering the program. We had $15,000 from the prior year that were used for security deposits, which GA really had not used because they were putting people up if they could find them, they were tending to put them up in hotels. So we've got that $15,000. Thinking the need may arise again, council agreed to carry that forward from last year into this year's budget. Gavro Place is the 35-unit housing project just opened up the street here on Pine Street. There was $126,732 still to be spent on that. That has been fully drawn down at this point. That is up, running. And we had a ribbon cutting on that about a month ago. Under the choice rental development, we had about $265,000, almost $266,000 that we had earmarked to help raise up with the 18 units that they are building. They're under construction now. As it turned out, Maine Housing was able to pick up the home dollars we had been planning to put into it. So rather than deal with two funders, they only had to deal with one. You folks agreed to say, okay, let's take that money and add it to $250,000 or so that we had for that we were planning to use for the choice projects, the Wedgwood projects will be coming before you over the next year or two. So we had about $448,000 that will be used of home dollars to help make the choice projects happen. And then there was another $112,639 that was available for some sort of rental project to be determined. So this is really keeping with the pattern that we have historically had for how we have used our home funds. This is what the Auburn Council approved back on August 1st. It should be noted that they sort of mashed what Auburn plans to do with the money with what we plan to do with the money. So you'll see at the bottom here, it's $1.7,829,000 in total. Auburn's program is primarily being focused on supportive services. They're going to be having a couple people on staff over there that'll be visiting the homeless populations, really putting supportive services. I think it's 2 or 3 people they're looking to hire. They have some non-congregate shelter development. They plan on putting some tenant-based rental assistance dollars out there. The 200, well, this is the combined budget. Let me show you. I'm sorry? No, go ahead.
So the 410 includes the 300,000 that we have and 110 from all.
Exactly. That's exactly where I was moving to, Councilor McCarthy, is this is what we had proposed. And then you said, hey, we'd like to get, so I wanted to give you all that as the background, but this particular slide shows bottom, middle column there was, this is what, based on the feedback we had received, really not having time to come to the council before that. By the time the plan was completed, there were no meetings left. So you got it unvarnished. My apologies to Councilor Clement. I know you would have liked to have seen it sooner, but here's what staff had proposed. And this is your opportunity to say, here's what we'd really prefer to do with the money. And I can plug in the numbers. Those right column are live. So you tell me numbers, I can plug them in.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you, Director Jeffers. I appreciate the effort that staff put into this. Councilor Jelinas.
Thank you. Director, the support services line item for Lewiston, you might have mentioned this last Tuesday, but can you just remind me what those support services entailed?
Yeah, it'll be a request for proposal, which we will put on the street saying we have dollars available. It'd be going to entities like New Beginnings,
Okay.
to Trinity. I just learned of I'm going to draw a blank on the name, but it's a gentleman I've known for years, Eddie Gray Fox,
Yeah.
who has a program.
Right.
I can't remember what it's called, but he had knocked on the door, just an email to me and say, hey, Link, is this something I'd be eligible for? And I think he likely would be. But that request for proposals has not yet been developed, but once we have a budget, we're looking to get that out there quickly. Did that address your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Anything else, Councilor?
No, thank you.
Councilor Scott.
Thank you. So a few different things. So when I was looking at the full plan, and I read it several times so I could hopefully wrap my head around it and see what was being talked about and everything, but particularly looking around the comments from the different groups that you talked to, the police departments, all the
Do you
New
mind
Beginnings.
bringing that slide back up?
There was a lot of folks that were spoken
Please
to.
continue.
Yep. And there were a lot of really good comments in the report itself that talked about, when I look at what Safe Voices said, that they had only this many available, but there were actually over 400 that asked for services. And when I look at the Lewiston Police Department saying that they could still use assistance with a resource officer to help with some of the services that are needed out there and the services that are needed. And then when I looked at some of the other New Beginnings and the youth services, I started thinking, well, and questioning, when we're looking at the total amount and we're looking at the affordable rental development, I understand where you're saying leveraging development of housing in the choice neighborhood, but we also already have several things happening with the choice neighborhood, correct? In close to 185 units, I think, we're looking at having built. We've had the Govero Place done. We allocated just this year, $448,000 to choice. I think this is wonderful things that are happening down there, but I'm wondering, and why I questioned some of this last week was, can we use that for other things that may be more necessary right now? And that being helping with some of our youth that are homeless, helping with the police for the resource officer, helping with maybe even a little bit more money towards somebody that's looking to do a shelter, looking at general assistance that it could possibly be used for funding for housing, for Safe Voices. I even thought about, can we use some of this for that public bathroom that we were talking about? And I'm not suggesting we use it for that, but there were other things out there, and I'm wondering if there is a better way to use this money, especially where it's a lot more than we generally get every year. And every year we go through this process and we do get funding and we do allocate money, but we've got a pretty good chunk to use here. Is there a way that we can use this to better help our community right now in a faster way? And that's why I wanted to talk about this a little more in the allocation of funds.
If I could just.
Yep.
I agree with it, and you broadened. I mean, Councilor Jelinek had asked, what are the supportive services? Most of the things you just mentioned are absolutely eligible. They would be. As you say, the store next door. The ride along with the police is something that's a supportive service to the homeless population. So all of those are potentially eligible. And if you'd like to give us direction on how to shape that request for proposals that we'll be putting out there.
Anything else, Councilor Scott?
Well, so I would make the suggestion that at this particular time, especially where we were able to give the little bit extra to the Choice Neighborhood at the beginning of the year, from I can't remember what your slide said originally, it was 237 or something to that effect to the 448. I would like to make the suggestion that instead of the 250 going to affordable rental development, we look at where we can put it towards support services that we need in our community, because I think we need them right now. That's my personal opinion, and I'm just putting that out there.
Councilor McCarthy, did you have anything?
Good evening, Director. My feeling on the shelter is I would like to see that directed for youth shelter specifically, to try to generate some interest out there for people to develop a youth shelter. I think that that's a great need in the area, and if not, then I would take some of that money and put it towards the support services, because I agree with Linda. I think those needs are definitely out there, and I think that no matter what we give to that category, it'll get spent. So I don't think they're lacking in a need in that category.
And am I allowed? Okay, not sure.
You are allowed.
I'm
Yes.
allowed. Okay, just to respond. I have had a conversation with Auburn where they will have 3 resource officers. They're not, I don't want to call them resource officers, but the people who are directly working with that population. They are primarily focused on Auburn. That's not to say they won't cross the river occasionally. So we have some support, that folks who will be, knocking, not calling at a tent, visiting tents, trying to engage that population. Again, their primary focus will be Auburn. So let's not make any bones about that. But if we all of a sudden we find an encampment of 50 people and we need support people to come and help, and we don't have the bodies to do it, I think that's the sort of situation where they would share in this resource.
Okay, thank you.
But point well made.
Councilor Harriman?
Thank you. So HUD says that this money has to be used specifically to address homelessness.
Yes.
Do they allow under their rules for us to direct it to specific segments of the homeless population and not others? Do you know if that is allowed?
As long as they are among those qualifying populations that I had a slide with, it was veterans, it was abused, people going through domestic violence issues, youth, as long as they're on that qualifying population, or at either currently homeless or on the edge of it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Councilor LaChapelle?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I tend to agree with councilors from Ward 1 and 2, just varying just a little bit. Taken into consideration, the ad hoc committee said the #1 issue for homelessness is not having affordable housing. So that comes out from the ad hoc committee. So my recommendation right now is to move $100,000 into the affordable rental development, because we still need more, and the more help, the better. And then take another $200,000 and move it into the support services to address, like the store next door, the police department, and just help some of those services immediately, and that would go a long ways. So that'd be my recommendation, to move 200 into support services, and 100 into affordable rental development.
From the shelter.
Well, that leaves $76,000 for planning and administration.
So you're saying it's no funding for congregate, non-congregate?
I'm saying I'd like to help those other two
Yep,
more.
got, I just wanted to confirm. I heard, got it.
Counselor Jelinas?
Thank you. My recommendation would be that we move 100,000 out of the affordable rental development, put that into support services, so that now becomes 272. I like Counselor McCarthy's recommendation about making the non-congregate shelter development specific to youth, but I would add families when I come back on the family unit thing again. And then, so that would be at 300,000, and then planning administration, obviously. Those are my recommendations.
Counselor Clement?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Kind of torn. I concur with what Councilor LaChapelle said. The Housing Committee came back with affordable rental development. That seems to be a phrase that comes up every other meeting. Affordable housing, affordable housing. We have the opportunity to move something into that. We do have some shovel-ready projects out there, which I think puts us a leg up on that. I do think there's a very big need for support services. I talk with the police frequently. They're interfacing. I mean, I know we have problems with recruiting and retention, and anything we can do to help them out in their quest would be greatly appreciated by them, and I think society as a whole in Lewiston would benefit from it. So I'm not sure which way to put the numbers. I like the idea of moving 200,000 to support services. I don't know why Auburn would have 3 and we have, I think, 1.5 now, I believe. Does that sound right? We only have 1.5. I think we have a greater need over here, and I think we need to address that need. So I'd say 200,000 to support services, and I'd say move 100,000 to affordable rental development. I am not a big fan of affordable housing because I don't think it solves a lot of problems for us. However, that seems to be one of the major points brought up by the Housing Committee, and if we need to address that, we need to address it. The planning, I understand the planning administration, that's a percentage of any of these grants that goes to whatever it goes to in planning administration. We don't go any further than that.
And that's over 3 years. That's
Yes.
not.
Oh, well, okay.
Or over
It's only a
multiple,
third.
actually, it's even a longer period with this grant.
In that case.
Yes.
But we don't have a non-congregate shelter developed yet. There's time in the future. I know the one big thing that I've heard 2 out of the last 3 years from my ward, and they are adamant about this, they don't want to see a bunch of tax dollars. I mean, these are tax dollars, but they're not local property tax dollars going into supporting any type of homeless shelter. So it is what it is. That's what I hear, and they're quite vocal about that. But I think by splitting it up pretty much the way Councilor LaChapelle spoke, I think that's a doable thing, and I would concur with that. Thank you.
You know, I understand the council's, desire to, kind of divvy up things differently. However, I mean, at this point, given what staff has done and the conclusions that they came to, I would recommend that we just leave it as is and accept staff's recommendation. Councilor Harriman?
Thank you. Could I just ask, were these numbers, were they determined by your talking, staff's talking to all those different stakeholders as to what the different needs were in the city? Is that where?
That was what informed the decision. Candidly, it was Jessica and I talking along with our counterparts in Auburn, sort of saying, how do we divvy this up? But it was not that we just did this without referring back to all the work that Jessica had done earlier. It was really identifying. On our side, we've got Section 8 certificates that aren't, there's no housing to use them in. There's no need to use tenant-based rental assistance on this side of the river. So there's already that resources there. So we thought, how can we use these dollars? But again, it's really up to the council on ultimately how you do it. But these were really the 3 leading things that all those, as Councilor Scott had read through all those comments, you know, these were the recurring themes, and it's just how do you divvy it up?
Okay, thanks, and thank you to all the staff who worked on this.
Councilor Scott.
Thank you. So just a little clarification. So in reading the report, one of the things that was mentioned, and I don't have it in front of me right now, and I apologize, but it spoke specifically that the addressing of lack of housing was being addressed, and that's why Auburn chose to use their funding towards services. So I question now, and I do, because if that's what if that's what they talked about when they went through this report, and that was Auburn and Lewiston looking at all of those suggestions from all of those different things, all of those different sources in both communities, and we know we have the whole block over here where the Leahy Funeral Home, right, there's all of this building that's going to be happening. We have Goverill Place that just went up. We have several projects that are getting ready to happen. And we already gave a little bit extra because it didn't go to Raise Up Co-op this year. I don't know that we need to be going to the affordable housing. I understand and I hear that, but I wonder where is the correct information here? Because one group said that housing is being taken care of. It's not enough yet, I agree, but it is happening. And the other one is saying that that's the top priority. We know we have projects in place, we have this. What we know we are lacking is services, and we don't have a shelter to help with youth and family. And that was one of the things that was also mentioned in the comments, that they don't have that shelter available for youth and family. We don't have the services needed. And I will tell you, I was at a friend's house yesterday that was right by the Promenade Mall, and there was quite a large something going on with, there's a large homeless shelter down there behind Essex Street and the Promenade Mall, and there's a large group of homeless people over there, not just in the Sunnyside Park neighborhood. And there were several police cars, ambulance, fire trucks. I'm not sure what was going on, but there was something. I think that our police department needs those services. We need to have that help. We need to hear it now before things get worse. And I would like to see personally it going towards an RFP to somebody, maybe a store next door, New Beginnings adding another house. They've got 12 beds. We do have upwards to 250 to 300 homeless students. I would like that money to be offered for something like that to start. We know that's not going to be enough, but it's a good chunk, and that would be a good start. I would like to see it come from there and go into the services and a homeless shelter. And I do believe that, as the Auburn City Council did, they made the decision to put all of their money towards the services. I believe that we should be able to do that as a council, knowing what's happening in our community, to make the decision where we're going to allocate these funds. Thank you.
Councilor McCarthy.
One of the things we have to take into consideration is Auburn has stated publicly that they're not interested in any affordable housing, that they're going for market rate, the upper end of the apartment. So we can't take their thought process and adapt it to our money, because their thought process is different than ours. So I don't know the exact split, but I'm of the opinion that we take that $300,000 and we split it between the first two, affordable development and services.
Yeah, I agree that things are a little different over here, and we have our choice neighborhood grant, and yeah, if staff feels that we need to move at least 250 into that to help support that, we need to do it. Director Jeffers, did you have something?
If I could just comment, well, there was the one side, I think it was $458,000 is what was allocated earlier this year for choice. Let me say that the project that Councilor Scott is talking about has seen significant cost increases. We have been working for the last several months. Misty Parker's been working very hard to figure out how to close that gap. How do we work with Maine Housing? How do we get that? So that $458,000, while it sounds like a lot of money, we could use more. And again, those are not local tax dollars, those are federal tax dollars that we're able to use. So just to help broaden the discussion. None of it's easy. I mean, it's all like,
Yeah. No,
it's like
and
a lot of money. It goes quick, you know?
I understand. I guess my point is that we need to support choice and make sure that it's a success. It's a game changer for our city. Councilor LaChapelle.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I agree. As a developer, I'm looking at a 60% increase in trusses over the last 2 years. So this, massive of a project, this budget was put together 2 to 3 years ago. Now we come to day one to moving an extra $100,000 into that, $350,000 is gone in a heartbeat, I agreed, adding the services, the $200,000 to services, that's something that's boots on the ground, immediate. You can get immediate return on that investment. And just as a former landlord or apartment house owner, I'm just looking at just the hurdles that we had to go through to try to remove lead. We can drive around the downtown, the Tree Streets area, and we can look at how many of these buildings are vacant, which could use a shot in the arm of $100,000. One building, $100,000. It cost me $400,000 to fix one of those buildings down there. We got a building on Pine Street. We got a stinking hole in the middle of Pine Street right now. It's been 3 weeks since it's fixed, and you got a vacant building right there. That could be some housing. So there's definitely a need for housing. So I'm all in favor. If we can switch it, I think $200,000 into the support services, which can address the New Beginning shelter, which can address the police department. Just put it into that support services and $100,000 into the building, or we can flip-flop it, $200,000 into the affordable rental and $100,000 into that. But I'm just all in favor of moving forward on that. Thank you.
Councilor Scott?
Thank you. So first off, I want to put it out there that just because I'm questioning this and looking at this does not mean that I do not support the Choice Neighborhood Grant and what's happening there. I 100% support it, and I think it's a phenomenal thing that's happening in our community. But I also think that it's our responsibility as counselors, when we look at money like this and we see the need that we have in our community, that we need to have these discussions and discuss it all, and that's why I've put it all out there. I would be able to agree that if we can use this to make more housing, I really want a shelter for the kids. It's like something that's really up there for me, but I think the services are also extremely needed, and so I would agree with what you just proposed. I would be okay with that.
Councilor Clement?
Let me just muddy the waters a little bit more and see if there's consensus for $150,000 each for 1 and 2. I mean, I'm good with any numbers, but I think 1 and 2 need the additional support. I say split it right down the middle, give them $150,000 each, affordable rental development and support services.
Take that from where? Shelter?
Take them from shelter. Yep.
And so zeroing, just so I'm clear, zeroing out the shelter.
Bring out the shelter, yep.
Anything further, Councilor?
Nope, thank you, sir.
Councilor Harriman?
Thank you. Just a question about timing. As far as the support services go, it says the city would issue an RFP to local nonprofits. What would be the sort of, I guess, the turnaround time on, when that money would really be being spent for support services?
That's a good question that I'm not the best guy to answer, unfortunately. I can tell you the legal process, we would be working, once we have an allocation, we'd start working on what we needed to do, get that RFP on the street. I think we'd, get it on the street probably early October, mid-October, and, make funding decisions, and folks can do what they propose. You need to give them a bit of time, though, to also say, hey, look, we've got, whether it's $172,000 or $300,000 that we've got available for support services, we need to say, here's the type of things we'd like to fund. Coming back to the process, I know we had some conversation last week trying to accelerate this. Looking back over the rule book we need to live within, even though under HOME-ARP regulations, all you needed was a 15-day public comment period. Under Lewiston Citizen Participation Plan, we have to have a 30-day public comment period. So once you make a recommendation on how we want to allocate this, we will put public notice out saying, here's how the money's going to be spent. Please let us know by such and such a date. But I think the earliest we can bring this back to the council for formal action would be the October 4th meeting. So sorry to share that news, but as Jessica, she sort of said, Lincoln, sorry to tell you this, but here's the way it works. And I went, okay, so.
Thank you for the
Yep.
information.
Yep.
So at this point, is it 1 or 200,000 to 1 and 2, or are we splitting it down the middle? How are we feeling?
You want to hit us each one at a time? So we can
I guess, yes.
Okay, so I would prefer that we put the 200 towards the support services and really pump that up, and 100 towards the affordable rental development.
I concur.
I'm fine with the allocations that staff has come up with. I think all three of these categories are equally deserving.
Councilman Chabot?
I agree with the councilors from Ward 1 and 2, 2 and 1.
1, 2, 4, 6 adds on, he concurs.
I'm not sure I understood that, but I think, did you just concur with your other counselors?
Disagreed, yeah.
I think originally I had suggested that we take 100 out of the affordable rental and put it into the support services, but after hearing, Councilor LaChapelle and hearing you talk about, elevated costs and that sort of thing, I would go along with the original proposal as presented by the city, as outlined here. I wouldn't touch it.
So what, so we're looking at what, 350 for affordable? And then 372, 0, and then the 76 for support services.
Just crash the system.
I thought I'd be able to edit it on the fly here, and it looks like it does not want to let me do that. I might need to back out of presenting.
And then that would, Administrator Hunter, that would go out for public comment here in the next few days?
That's correct.
Okay.
So, and I'm sorry, Carl, I was fussing around trying to get it on the slide, which isn't live, so 350 for
I
housing.
have it, Lincoln.
You got it?
Yep.
Good, okay.
I think we're good.
Good.
Anything else you'd like to add, Director Jeffers?
No, I appreciate your consideration of this. I know, as I say, lots of competing priorities here. It's tough. And, I wish we had 3 times as much money, but we don't. So thank you.
Thank you. And that concludes our workshop.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, Administrator.
Are you going to open the special meeting to vote to go into executive session?
That's exactly what we'll be doing.
Thank you.
Can we have a motion to go into executive session?
So moved.
Oh,
I'm sorry?
what is I guess, what is the correct order of operations here?
We're opening the business meeting now. The first agenda item is to make a motion to go at executive session
We are,
pursuant to Title, MRSA Title I, Section 4056C, to discuss an economic development issue which premature disclosure of the information will prejudice the competitive bargaining position of the city.
yes, we are opening up the meeting and may I have a motion?
So moved.
Councilor McCarthy, followed by Councilor Clement.
All in favor?
All in favor?
We'll be going in executive session. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'm so used to Kathy calling the roll.